Chapter 853. Johnson threw away the forged steel horse-slaying sword. To be more precise, the paladin grabbed the ball of weight and pulled out a short sword made of obsidian. Then, he threw away the long sword held by the emperor. Using the new weapon, he attacked again. Sacrificial blow. Johnson did not adhere to the usual martial arts of the paladin. Like a well-trained assassin, he crashed into the emperor's arms. He held the obsidian short sword in a reverse grip and stabbed it into the emperor's chest. Divine persuasion. Just as the emperor was about to tear off Johnson's armor and tear him to pieces, the paladin once again summoned the power of kindness and launched a baptism on him. The emperor felt that his whole body was about to be smashed into pieces again as the holy power surged into his body. However, it seemed that because of the obsidian short sword, he was not directly annihilated into ashes. "What did you do?" the emperor exclaimed. He could feel that the divine energy was deeply embedded into his body like thousands of threads. They were like a fishing net, tightly wrapping around the emperor. Although he didn't feel anything strange, he suddenly had a feeling that he couldn't control himself. What the emperor did not know was that divine persuasion was not so much a skill of the sacred samurai, but rather a belief of theirs. They could complete the persuasion process by directly annihilating the evil in the eyes of the sacred samurai, and like now, they could imprison the enemy in place and summon all the marked teammates to the place to persuade them. This was also a way to solve the problem. "Advise you to do good," Johnson replied softly. In the blink of an eye, dozens of rays of light formed a prison that encircled the emperor. Hieronymus, Petrov, Duhala, Tom. The chief paladins of Ramsey were all summoned, including Dalton, the son of Johnson's old friend. In addition, 2 blazing god servants also arrived at the same time. In the past 12 years, with the help of the resources of the scale of perpetual order and the favor of the power of virtue, Jensen had not only organized a loose alliance of paladins under the command of the good gods of order in the Ramsey Plain, but he had also established solid friendships with some heavenly creatures in Sigil City. The 2 blazing sky god servants were the representatives, and they were both saint samurai. "Is there a need to go to this extent?" The emperor gritted his teeth. Jensen ignored him and nodded to the sacred samurai who had come to help. "The enemy is here, and so am I." He waved his hand and pointed at the emperor, who had a horrified expression. "Accept the divine judgment, evil tyrant." When all the saint samurai turned their eyes to the emperor, his body suddenly emitted a dazzling red light. Jensen used the most tolerant, be it order or chaos, and the harshest, not letting go of a single trace of evil, power of kindness to judge the emperor. The latter's body emitted a glaring red light, indicating that he was not only a complete villain, but also had a lot of blood on his hands. "Unforgivable!" A blazing sky god servant who had been summoned said angrily. As he said this, a large amount of dark yellow sand and stones were instantly molded into a bowl-shaped square. The saint samurai stood on the steps of the bowl, and the emperor stood at the bottom of the bowl, about to bear the anger of the saint samurai. The name of this blazing sky god servant was Ordovician. He was like a giant with yellow jade eyes, his skin shining with a metallic luster, and 3 pairs of white wings on his back. Blazing sky god servants were the most powerful of the angels. They usually served as the right-hand men of the gods, or simply guarded a world or plane alone. Although as long as they were willing, almost all good gods were very willing to promote a blazing god servant as a follower god, the proud blazing god servant rarely accepted such good intentions. They had their own goals to fulfill. Every blazing sky god servant was born with their own name. It was usually related to the major good deeds they had done before their reincarnation, and could also reflect part of their power. For example, Ordovician was named after a geological era in a certain plane. Before he was reincarnated as a blazing sky god servant, he had single-handedly alleviated the large-scale extinction of races at the end of that geological era due to climate and geological changes. It was because of this good deed that he became a glorious blazing sky god's servant after his reincarnation. As long as he stood on the ground, he could easily manipulate the power of the earth elemental. Seconded, the other blazing sky divine attendant also expressed his opinion. Although he was also a giant with 3 wings on his back, his skin was the color of sapphire, and the armor on his body was branded with star patterns. His name was Polaris. Like Ordovician, he had a series of magical abilities bestowed upon him by the heavens. His spellcasting abilities were comparable to the most powerful priests. He didn't even need to use his full strength to exterminate peak fiends, such as the pit fiends and balers. However, Polaris held an enchanted longbow in his hands. He was a blazing sky god servant who was extremely adept at tracking, and was often active in the astral plane. It was said that he had once followed the tracks left behind in the astral plane, and found a baler that had flown past the day before. Furthermore, he had only used a killing arrow that he had created with a spell to kill that demon. The 2 heavenly creatures, who could be said to be highly respected, had set the tone for this divine persuasion ceremony. The other human paladins all clenched their great swords or spiked hammers, leaping down from the stairs and taking the lead to charge towards the emperor trapped in the bowl-shaped plaza. Because Jensen had mobilized much of the power of kindness, these paladins were able to use their holy force much more freely here. Moreover, because they were facing an unforgivable enemy, they did not adhere to the virtues of a paladin in a fair duel. After all, Jensen and the 2 blazing sky god servants had already verified that this was a duel between good and evil. Everyone had to use their full strength, only then would it be truly fair. His body is a powerful soul spellcaster, and he can be reborn in the body of a monster he created. Polaris's eyes shone like stars. Even though Jensen had not had time to tell him, this blazing sky god servant who was extremely adept at tracking instantly saw through the Emperor's various abilities. Eliminate evil. Ordovician waved his hand, and a giant sword suddenly appeared in his palm. We have to be patient. Even if he revives 1,000 times, 10,000 times, as long as he doesn't die, we won't leave. After saying this, Ordovician also entered the plaza. He did not even use a teleportation spell, and only relied on his extraordinary agility. This powerful warrior cut into the battle like a flash. When the battle began, it was as if they had practiced it many times. This blazing sky god servant casually poured weaken and advanced dispel magic on the Emperor, and at the same time, buffed the paladins on his side with various spells. And every time another paladin was injured, a healing spell would instantly fall on that person. I have to show my hand too. Seeing his old friend fight hard, Polaris immediately drew the enchanted longbow in his hand. As he quickly ran out of the battle circle, killing arrows repeatedly shot towards the Emperor from various tricky angles. Even though the Emperor constantly replenished himself with various spells to defend against the arrows, under the pressure of the rapid shooting like a machine gun, he still paled in comparison. It's my turn too. Jensen now had no weapon in his hand, but he did not care about this problem. 2 fists lightly bumped together, and the holy power instantly enshrouded the knuckles of his fist. Chapter 854. When an evil mage-type boss met a powerful paladin, he would most likely be beaten to a pulp. The interaction between the Emperor and Jensen had proven this point. And now, when the Emperor encountered a group of tyrannical paladins, especially when there were 2 blazing celestial servants who were so powerful that it made one's hair stand on end, this evil magic-type boss could only lament, "Take the bamboo shoots." More than a dozen Saint Samurai with top-notch combat ability were attacking the leader of the monsters without any morals. Such a tragic scene was not common in the multiverse. The Emperor's body, which resembled the Wendigo, was soon covered in wounds. There were cuts caused by swords, slashes, and blunt force injuries caused by hammers. Similar to the Emperor, who was full of resentment, the god of virtual games, Stim, who had left early due to an emergency, was not having a good time either. He was caught in a dynamic and multifaceted game. Although he had held back his grief and basically given up on the gnomes in the Steam City, he was now faced with a new dilemma. Should he protect his game godhood, or should he protect the virtual kingdom? And all this started with the bandits, who had wreaked havoc on Gnome Island for days. A mere contract demon was able to make a god's avatar run in circles. Although most of the credit was due to the Scales of Eternity's Combat Research Lab, Narman had done a good job. They had kept the Steam City's airship fleet in the depths of the swirling plains. At this time, Narman had established contact with all the monsters released by the Ghostface fish. Harpies, swamp people, gnolls, chimeras. These monsters, whether difficult or powerful, were all on the opposite side of the gnomes under Narman's guidance. Not only did they defeat the ground forces sent by the Steam City, but they were now trying to shoot down the gnome's airship. Narman had to create an opportunity for them. "Now, listen to me." Narman did not shout very loudly, but his words were accurately transmitted to everyone's ears and were very persuasive. "Abandon all heavy equipment and only carry weapons, ammunition, food, and water. Now that the airships are stuck behind us, we have to create an opportunity to shoot them down so that we can escape." After saying that, Na-Men was the first to jump off his warhorse and quickly packed up his things. After a few days of traveling, the Mount's stamina was already at its limit, even if their food was mixed with energy elixirs that nourished the body. Since they no longer had to traverse the plains and beaches, they had to climb to the top of the mountain. That was why Naaman had all the pirates of Jorms release their mounts and let them go. "Let's go." After checking everyone's equipment, a smile bloomed on Naaman's face under the cloak. Like a tear in the darkness, it flashed by. "We have to climb the mountain. Drink the rest of your energy elixirs." Reality proved that his arrangements were all targeted. Climbing the highest mountain in the spiral plains was definitely a tough job. In particular, as they clambered over the rocks and cliffs, numerous toad-like swamp people, surviving gnolls, and harpies with strange, sinister laughter would occasionally appear near them, and huge chimeras cast their shadows from the sky. Even though the wild monsters did not attack the pirates of Jorms because of the weapons in their hands and Na-Men's deterrence, they still encountered all kinds of surprises while climbing the mountain, which still made them tremble in fear. After all, even though these guys did not attack, the malice under their ugly skins could not be hidden no matter how hard they tried. Only Na-Men was more at ease. He was very confident in his persuasion skills. At least before the spell lost its effectiveness, he believed that these wild monsters would obediently follow him by the nose. As for what would happen after the spell lost its effectiveness, they would have to be alive until then to talk about it. There's going to be a fierce battle coming up. We have to lure the airships to a lower altitude. In fact, even if they did not use the strategy of luring the enemy, the airship troops sent by Stim would still pursue them relentlessly, regardless of the cost. Because the actions of Na-Men and the pirates on Dwarf Island had already vaguely shown some characteristics of the game, as a god with the priesthood of the game, Stim could not lose control of this game. Instead of dealing with all kinds of variables, the best solution was to let Na-Men and the pirates completely withdraw from the game. For the great god, we have to get rid of all these ants. Standing on the deck of the airship, the military chaplain took in the figures of Na-Men and the pirates with the help of the telescope. He decisively ordered the aircraft to launch a wave of bombing first. Just as the airship's launcher opened and the aerial bombs rolled out, a few huge figures suddenly appeared in the sky not far away. In the blink of an eye, these chimeras were like flies that had smelled a crack in an egg. They wriggled their three strange heads and flew below the pygmy airship, extending their heads towards the hatch of the launcher. Because these magic beasts had just used spells to conceal their bodies, and their flying speed was also very fast, when they launched a pouncing attack on the airship like hyenas, the midget pilots did not have time to react. Blazing flames, acid and poisonous fog instantly poured into the airship's hold. Some of the pilots were luckier, grabbing the featherfall, life-saving rune board and jumping out of the other exits in time. But since most of them fell into the hands of the harpies hovering at low altitude, the word lucky would have to be put in quotation marks to describe them. Those who were unlucky had their aerial bombs detonated by the Chimera's flames, and were destroyed along with the airship and the Chimera that was choking them. More than 20 airships would basically explode in the air if they were pouncing on by the Chimera. Unless there were some military chaplains of the god of virtual games on board like the flagship. Those chaplains worked together to summon powerful divine spells in time, either killing the Chimera or countering its breath to save the airship. In just a few minutes, the Steam City's aviation unit had lost 5 airships, losing almost a quarter of the entire unit. Emergency landing. Looking at the group of harpies swarming after the Chimera's ambush, the remaining midget pilots of the airships made the same decision in unison. Not only could the airships launch bombs, but they also carried a large number of mechanical chocobo riders and steam tanks. They believed that they could quickly end the battle as long as they dragged the battlefield to the ground. Little did they know that these people's actions had saved Na-Men a lot of schemes that he hadn't had time to execute yet. Giving me a pillow when I'm sleepy. Na-Men was secretly delighted. Chapter 855. Since ancient times, a boss would appear at the end of the game. In the final moments of the game, there was no reason not to send out their strongest forces to suppress the situation. When Na-Men brought all the pirates of Joms up the mountain with great difficulty, he saw the pygmy airship that had been forced to land by the suicidal attacks of the chimeras and harpies. He decisively took out a curved horn. This horn had a circular hoop on it. It was dark in color, but it had a metallic luster to it. It was made from the horn of a pit fiend. Restricted by magic, the pit fiend would also listen to the horn's commands. Woo 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 woo. The deep sound of the horn rang out, and a sudden noise came from behind the mountain range. A small crimson airship quickly climbed up from the bushes at the foot of the mountain, following the sound all the way to the peak of the mountain range. The devil fish. A sharp-eyed pirate of Joms recognized the airship. They had ridden on it to cross the sea. However, they would never have guessed that the devil fish had another face. A terrifying face emerged from the front of the airbag. After reaching a high altitude, the entire airship began to curl up. It had 4 limbs and a tail, and dragon-like wings sprouted from its body. Scales as thick as armor grew out of it as well. It was also a Leviathan airship, similar to the Nephremon disc. However, the devilfish's original form was not a megalosaurus, but a pit fiend at the top of the Batsu devil clan. Awakened by the horn, the pit fiend nicknamed the devilfish opened its eyes in an instant. Its round eyes were like those of a fish. As expected, there were only wrong names but no wrong nicknames. Hellfire Storm. The devilfish waved its palms, and the power that had accumulated in its body was released. Febrile winds and flames spewed out from its fingertips, forming a dense cluster of fireballs like a rocket launcher. They passed by the dumbfounded pirates of Joms, rushing towards the pygmies who were gathering their troops. The moment it appeared, the pit fiend displayed its absolute strength. It crushed the formation of the mechanical chocobo riders and steam tanks that came out of the pygmy airship. Ah! The Devil Ray laughed wildly. His figure flickered twice, and when he reappeared, he was already beside a steam tank. The pit fiend reached out with its steel-like arms, grabbing the base of the steam tank and flipping it over. Seeing this, the priests on the dwarf's side began to summon their divine spells one after another. However, this cunning demon did not give them a chance to lock onto it. He used greater teleportation without restraint, always appearing in unexpected places and launching surprise attacks. Moreover, in the process of attacking, he was constantly using spells to command all sorts of monsters, swamp men, gnolls, chimeras, and even harpies. Every pit fiend was an experienced tactician. Under his command, these fools began to learn how to combine their strengths to launch even more ferocious attacks on the pygmies. The swamp men, who resembled giant toads, flanked their opponents from the flanks. They spat out their slimy tongues to harass the gnome riders on the mechanical chocobos. The chimeras landed on the ground, and with their thick hides and proficient breath attacks, they blocked the advance of the gnome steam tanks from the front. The harpies reached the side of the gnome airships and tore at the airbags with their sharp claws. The gnolls, on the other hand, quietly circled around and slipped into the open belly of the airship. "Delay this army. Don't finish them off so quickly," Naaman ordered the devilfish. Of course, he still had to rely on the infernal horn in his hand. Otherwise, the strength of a contracted demon would not be enough to subdue the prideful pit fiend. Before leaving, Keyes had given him instructions. The purpose of this battlefield behind the enemy lines was not to cause great damage to the pygmies, but to restrain them. The god of virtual games had to retaliate by introducing game modes in order to fulfill his duties as a divine being. As long as you can divert a portion of his attention, it will be a great achievement. These were Keyes' words. The reason the young blue dragon said this was because he'd reached an agreement with Jarl Dazzlegold. He'd used the guarantee of the survival of the pygmies in Ramsey after the war as a bargaining chip to obtain a portion of Stim's secrets from the great pygmy god. It was because of this that Keyes had the confidence to severely injure or even kill the god. Not long after the expeditionary army set out from King's Landing, Keyes also set out on his own journey. The young blue dragon dove into the sea, swimming all the way to the outer seas of Pygmy Island. Neither the expeditionary army nor the pygmies entrenched on the island knew of this news. Stim was only a lesser god at the moment, and his divinity level was not high. Even with the help of the power of his clone in the material plane, his range of perception would not exceed a dozen miles. Therefore, the god of virtual games did not notice Keyes stopping a few hundred miles away from Pygmy Island. The young blue dragon hid under the surface of the sea, and without using any spells, for fear of being detected by divine power, he began to dig at the seabed with his claws. 4 other species of Megalosaurus, working underwater might be a little difficult. Fortunately, the blue dragon was an expert at digging holes. With Keyes' size and strength, the underwater environment did not affect him much. He dug down and filled the hole behind him, and only began to dig horizontally when he was close to the mantle layer of Ramsey. After anchoring in the direction of Pygmy Island, Keyes carefully pushed in that direction bit by bit. Because his body was too large, the slightest carelessness would cause the earth to shake, so he had to sacrifice speed in exchange for peace. When Keyes dug to the location of Pygmy Island, he finally found the astral slug that Jarl Dazzlegold had mentioned. The astral slug was a huge worm-like creature that lived in the deep trenches and craters between the astral and airless microplanes. The abnormal physiology of this slug allowed it to survive in a vacuum. Most astral slugs could grow up to 3,000 to 4,000 feet in length. This creature was a sexless silicon-based life form that reproduced through division. When it grew to a certain size, the astral slug would usually split into 2 smaller larvae. But sometimes this division did not happen. Astral slugs were full of treasures. Their crystalline organs were used in many electronic devices. Their extremely tough skin could be made into a good abrasive. Their flesh could store electricity. Some of their body fluids could be refined and used in the alchemical industry. Therefore, the astral slugs were crazily hunted by the Githyanks, who also lived in the astral and pursued expansionism. The overbearing Githyanks' Lich Queen had ordered that no other race was allowed to take even one astral slug away from the astral. Even as a god, Stim had spent a lot of money to buy the larvae of an astral slug from the astral smugglers. In order to raise this creature in the material plane, he had used the divine power that had the power to change everything to raise it. Stim's goal was to modify this astral slug and turn it into a unique living server. He wanted to build his own divine kingdom on earth. Chapter 856. One had to admit that Stim's idea was very grand. So far, due to the rules set by the God of gods, no god had been able to build a holy kingdom for the management of petitioners in the material plane. In addition, that existence had once caused a catastrophe called the Turbulent Age in the world of Toriel, which was the focus of the world's attention, and had banished a group of gods to the material plane, where they had experienced a real sense of helplessness. Since then, no god would easily descend to the material plane with their true body. The reason was simple. They had discovered that the material plane was not a paradise, and they could be killed by ordinary things and have their divinity taken away. The reason why the God of gods had done so was to maintain the safety of the multiverse. He believed that the gods were merely agents of the priesthood, or rather, they were merely symbols in philosophy. But the problem was that this symbol had self-consciousness, and the divine power that they had mastered had the power to change reality. Many disasters had occurred in the multiverse, and most of them were actually caused by unscrupulous gods. In order to prevent trouble before it happened, the God of gods used thunderous means to inoculate all the gods. He made all the gods understand that matter was the basis of existence, and ensuring the safety of the material plane was his bottom line. If a god dared to descend to the material plane for their own selfish reasons and squander their divine power to change reality, the God of gods would not show any mercy to them. After all, they were just tools used to symbolize the priesthood, and they were not irreplaceable. Although the above were only secrets passed down among the most powerful and oldest gods, the younger or weaker gods did not know much about it. All the gods had indeed developed a common sense. Unless it was a last resort, they should never let their true body descend to the material plane. Because in that case, even if the God of gods did not kill them, thousands of ambitious people would immediately rush over from all over the multiverse, like flies smelling a crack in an eggshell, and try to snatch the immortal glory from them. When that time came, although the gods were powerful, without the protection of the divine kingdom and the power of faith provided by the petitioners, they could still be crushed to death by the numerous adventurers like an elephant. It was not that no god had ever thought of establishing a holy kingdom in the material plane. In this way, on the one hand, it would be convenient for him to monopolize the belief of an entire plane. On the other hand, he could use the material plane as a barrier to defend against hostile gods. However, after witnessing the bleak or miserable experiences of many pioneers, most of the gods gave up on this idea. However, Stim wasn't so depressed. Instead, he came up with an original plan. It's not easy to establish a divine kingdom in a material plane, so I might as well establish a virtual divine kingdom. In any case, the main function of the divine kingdom for the gods was to accommodate the petitioners and concentrate their power of faith. Didn't some of the demon lords of the bottomless abyss and the devil lords of the 9 prisons of Bader also rely on virtual divine personas to obtain power comparable to the gods? Why can't I do the opposite and use the virtual divine kingdom and the virtual petitioners to provide energy for my godhood? After some research, and mainly because of the clergy of virtual games, Stim actually found a method that had a high chance of success. He bought the larva of an astral slug and quietly raised it in the Ramsey plane. He used his divine power to forcibly cultivate this silicon-based life form from an otherworldly creature into a species of this plane. With the help of the natural crystal components that grew in the body of this creature, Stim transformed it into a living game server. The virtual games that the dwarf priests and Ramsey's human monks practiced on a daily basis were actually in the form of data, and they were mounted in the body of this astral slug. After more than 100 years of training, this astral slug had gradually evolved. Because he was a dwarf, Stim originally only wanted to upload the human believers of Ramsey into this living server after they died to become virtual petitioners. However, due to the pressure of the army of King's Landing City, he could only let the Emperor upload the dwarf residents of Steam City. Now, except for the souls of the other dwarf gods, the souls of the other residents had all become virtual petitioners and were uploaded into the body of this astral slug. It was no exaggeration to say that Stim's ambition of building a divine kingdom on land was only one step away from being realized. If he was allowed to complete this feat, then he could hardly be threatened anymore. Even a god as powerful as the dwarf god, Jar Dazzling Gold, would not be able to destroy this god of virtual games unless he dared to disobey the rules of the gods above and destroy the Ramsey Plane. And the last step was for him to erase the astral slug's self, change his own race, and merge into this astral slug. By then, Stim's true body would be the divine kingdom, and the divine kingdom would be his true body. The cycle would repeat itself endlessly. However, it was as if there was an invisible hand in the unseen world that was always fiddling with the trajectory of Stim's fate. Just as this god was about to stabilize, Keys actually dug a tunnel and directly crashed into the breeding room of this astral slug. The moment he saw the astral slug, the young blue dragon did not hesitate at all. He immediately opened his super-giant mouth, which had been famous for his prowess since he was a child. With just one bite, Keys bit off a piece of flesh from the astral slug's body, along with crystals and wires. He chewed a couple of times and swallowed it down. The divine power restriction that Stim had placed on the astral slug's body kept retaliating, sending out violent explosions or sinister curses. However, the young blue dragon relied on his thick skin and thick flesh to ignore them. If not for the fact that the astral slug's body was so huge that it was comparable to Keys's current body, the young blue dragon would have swallowed it whole in 2 or 3 bites. Of course, in the face of the gluttonous Megalosaurus, this astral slug was not willing to be its prey. Not only did it immediately send out a distress signal to its master god, but it also began to try to use the virtual petitioners and the power of faith that they contributed to save itself. While it constantly used its divine power to repair its torso that Keys was gnawing on it, it turned its head around to bite the young blue dragon instead. However, after being beaten by various types of powers such as psionic powers, spells, force field energy, and blazing sun power, it decisively gave up on the suicidal choice of competing with Keys to see who could eat faster. How could it compare to the Megalosaurus that had the soul of the foodie empire? Therefore, it could only turn to its advantage and use its great divine power to restrain Keys's gnawing. On the astral slug's crystal-like body, pulse-like lights flickered. In order to cause more damage to Keys, it even drove some of the virtual petitioners to self-destruct at the Megalosaurus. It must be admitted that under the threat of death, the astral slug still burst forth with power that was not to be underestimated. The virtual petitioners kept self-destructing and really broke a few of the young blue dragon's teeth. However, as if they were destined opponents, after being wounded, Keys's active self-adaptation ability suddenly kicked in. His body's resistance to the explosion of divine power became higher and higher. Not long after, even if the virtual petitioners self-destructed, the divine power that burst forth would be absorbed by the young blue dragon and used to repair the damage in his body. Under his skin that outsiders could not see at all, Keys's evolution gate opened again. Although he had yet to produce new organs, many mysterious runes naturally extended from his bones and muscles, which were harder than refined gold, to sort out the divine power that rushed into his body and turn it into the driving force for evolution. His furnace-like stomach became more and more adapted to digest silicon-based life forms. When the astral slug's flesh and blood fell into his stomach, it turned into energy that nourished his body in a flash. What Quest didn't expect was that after absorbing a large amount of divine power, his quantum breathing organ, which hadn't changed for a long time, seemed to have suddenly become active. It was different from the hazy feeling in the past. It should be noted that although Keys had used this extremely wonderful breath before, he could not fully master it himself. In the battle against the tyrant worm, the Lord of the Abyss, although he had used quantum breath to successfully erase the rationality of the other parties' existence from a conceptual level, he still did not know how to effectively supplement it after that. He had tried to swallow the Nether River like a whale, and with the help of the power of the maze in the river, he could indeed charge a limited amount of quantum energy. But that was only adding to external objects. Every time he used his breath in the headquarters, he would have to go to the Nether River and drink, wouldn't he? But now, whether it was the divine power or the astral slug's flesh and blood that was naturally compatible with the virtual game priesthood, the quantum energy in his body began to become active, and he seemed to have a much deeper understanding of this wonderful power. Maybe, Keys's mind moved and quantum energy instantly spread to his limbs and bones. Although the young blue dragon still had a clear appearance, its essence suddenly became a quantum state that was between existence and non-existence. At this moment, a killing spell, composed of pure divine power, suddenly bombarded Keys. After receiving the astral slug's distress signal, Stim quickly rushed over to rescue his precious treasure. Because his clone had suffered in front of the young blue dragon, he was not careless at all. He directly used his divine power and authority to cast a divine spell that could seize the life and death of Keys, a powerful mortal being. Unfortunately, he was one step too late. If he had come just a moment earlier, this vengeful blow would have at least seriously injured Keys, a mortal being. Because of his mysterious quantum state, Keys was conceptually between existence and non-existence, so Stim's observation was no longer accurate. His power was like punching cotton, and there was no point of resistance at all. Replacing it is also a method of devouring. After recovering from his daze, Keys suddenly understood. Chapter 857. I can replace him. With a thought, Keys's body suddenly disappeared. The next moment, the astral slug that was writhing nonstop became stiff. It did not have the ability to actively adapt like Keys did. The moment it fell into the quantum state, there was a serious disconnect between the consciousness of this giant slug and its body. Then, it was completely erased from the concept out of thin air. In the eyes of the dumbfounded Stim, Keys' figure seemed to have merged with the astral slug that he had painstakingly cultivated, and the two were intertwined. On the figure of the young blue dragon, there seemed to be countless bloody mouths that opened at the same time and swallowed the astral slug without leaving anything behind. This was just his subjective observation, a cognitive product that was fed back to his own consciousness. In fact, did Keys, who was in the quantum state, open his mouth? Did he open his mouth in the present, the past, or the future? Did the astral slug even exist in the first place? These questions were all unknown to him now. Fortunately, he was a god. If an ordinary mortal observed this scene, he would probably have died in an instant. Even so, there was a momentary pause in his brain as a god. Could this guy be an ancient evil creature? That would explain why he doesn't look like a megalosaurus. But aren't ancient evil creatures incompatible with gods? Could this guy be the god of ancient evil creatures? Unable to understand Keys, who was in the quantum state, even if he was a god, there would still be a series of cognitive paradoxes. After all, although they had powers that were different from ordinary beings, they were not omnipotent and omniscient existences. Although the gods in the multiverse knew many secrets that mortals could not know, as representatives of the priesthood, they could only use it as a starting point and have a limited understanding of the linear causality products. The existence of the non-linear discrete state was actually a mystery that they could never see through, and this was the natural limitation of the god. Stim wanted to forcibly understand, but he was instantly subjected to an unbearable weight, and his incarnation immediately showed signs of instability. Even though he had sensed the danger, stopped thinking, and even forcibly deleted the memory of the previous moment, Stim's incarnation still couldn't help but spit out a mouthful of pale golden blood. At this moment, he could only remember the false memories he had constructed for himself. Keys had swallowed the entire astral slug, which was the carrier of the divine kingdom of the material plane, when he was unprepared. Then, he suffered a backlash and was severely injured. Stim could only use his false memories to find a reasonable explanation for his current situation. Fortunately, this god's brain worked fast enough. If he didn't realize that he was lying to himself, and instead continued to ponder over it, and then started to doubt himself, Keys didn't have to do anything, and he would have already been driven out of the realm of his priesthood by his own self-doubt. That was close. The god's heart tightened. Although he only remembered that he had been bitten back and not the real truth, his emotions were the same. However, Stim was, after all, a person who could climb from an ordinary being to the throne of a god. He immediately adjusted his state of mind, and the way he looked at Keys gradually regained its calmness and composure. "You will die here today," Stim said. Gods had always been strict with their words. Even gods who had priesthoods such as lies and conspiracies would never deceive themselves. Not to mention, at this moment, Stim only remembered that Keys had swallowed the astral slug, which ruined his ambition to build a virtual divine kingdom on the land. He had now made up his mind to kill this megalosaurus today, no matter what. After saying that, he waved his hand gently and moved Quith and himself from the deep underground cave to the surface of Dwarf Island as if it was as light as a feather. Thanks to the large-scale uploading of new lives launched by the Emperor in the Steam City, some of the souls of the dwarf residents had not been absorbed into the astral slug, which was the virtual divine kingdom. At this time, they had become the arms of Stim's incarnation. Although each soul that was transformed into a virtual petitioner only provided about half of the faith power of a real petitioner every day, as long as the astral slug stored it up, it would still be a considerable amount of wealth over a long period of time. But now, in order to slay the megalosaurus that had repeatedly ruined his plans, Stim could only treat those virtual petitioners as disposable items. He blended them into the essence of divine energy, and directly used it to fill the emptiness of his own divine power. After all, there were originally almost 1 million residents in Dwarf Steam City. Even if the virtual petitioners that Stim could use were only a portion of them, it was still a considerable number. If they could all be converted into real petitioners in Stim's divine kingdom, it would not be impossible for the god of virtual games to instantly rise to the standard of an intermediate divine power. With so much divine power to squander, Stim's incarnation naturally did not have to be stingy. All sorts of divine spells rained down upon the blue dragon youth like a rain of flowers. First, he blanketed Keys with a wave of curses as if he was trying to gather a list of curse-type divine spells. He did not consider Keys's spell resistance and immunity, seeking only the most. Then, he began to mimic all sorts of evocation spells with divine spells, throwing sound waves, flames, ice, acid, and lightning at Keys. Finally, Stim repeatedly used miracle spells to mimic instant death spells, delivering more than a dozen death decrees to Keys to vent his anger. At first, the pensive Keys had wanted to withdraw from his quantum form after devouring the astral slug. However, Stim's reckless bombardment extinguished that thought at once, and he obediently maintained his quantum form. Otherwise, if his resistance and immunity really did not hold, he would have lost half of his life. Thankfully, he managed to survive. This time, Stim's carpet bombing had shaken the entire dwarf island. Apart from the lack of radiation, it was no different from being bombarded by a nuclear bomb. After the powerful evocation spell, many mushroom clouds rose from the ground. This was caused by the smoke and dust from the explosion. The shock waves were like an iron plow, digging several feet deep into the spiral planes. The Junglefoot Expeditionary Army that was fighting in the streets of the Steam City had no choice but to run to an open area to avoid the disaster caused by the earthquake. After the aftershocks, The pirates of Joms who had climbed up a mountain to the east of Dwarf Island and were watching the pit fiend massacre the steam city's ground forces were all dug out from the ground by Naaman. They were like freshly unearthed yam eggs. What just happened? Fear gripped their hearts. The pit fiend, which had been full of vigor just a moment ago, was now riddled with scars and bruises. This was because Naaman had forcefully ordered the pit fiend to take a hit for his troops at the last moment. Chapter 858. North of the Iguana Strait, near Coral City, an aquatic pygmy fishing boat was still working. Catching the fat fish that migrated due to the ocean currents in these waters was their most important livelihood during this period of time. Different from the common ships, this fishing boat was a double-hulled rack boat, mainly used to carry the fish that was caught. As for the aquatic pygmy crew, they actually all survived in the sea without any worries. The boss of the boat was an old grandmother. Since the great Lord Godgar Dazzling Gold migrated here from Dwarf Island, she could be regarded as the third generation. She was very familiar with the means needed to make a living at sea. Standing at the bow of the rack boat, the old aquatic pygmy attached her lobster-like abdomen to a long pole. She kept looking at the distant sky, trying to judge whether there was a rainstorm or a gale through the changes in the sky. A feeling of uneasiness suddenly gripped her heart. Something was approaching, and armor and swords made a clanking sound, like a cold wind. The old grandmother turned around and saw a young dwarf standing behind her without her noticing. This was a native pygmy, not an aquatic subspecies. He was wearing golden armor that was adorned with jewels that were as numerous as the stars. Even the skin that was exposed had a noble golden luster. "Great God!" the old grandmother exclaimed. She had recognized that the pygmy who suddenly appeared looked exactly the same as the god statue she saw in the temple of His Majesty Gar Dazzling Gold. He was Gar Dazzling Gold's avatar. As a powerful god, as long as he was willing, even if it was his own avatar, Gar Dazzling Gold could still make him split into many avatars to perform many different tasks. In some cases, this ability was very useful. For example, when the waters around Coral City were about to be attacked by undercurrents and tsunamis, the vigilant pygmy Lord God immediately split into tens of thousands of avatars to provide precious protection for his people. Before the old grandmother of the aquatic pygmies could recover from the surprise of encountering a god, she found that all her children and grandchildren, who had been setting up nets underwater, had all appeared on the rack boat. In the blink of an eye, they were all transferred to the port of Coral City. At this moment, the coral smoke pipes at the top of the temple, which was located in the most central area of the city, were spewing out colorful bubbles. These bubbles piled on top of each other and stuck together, eventually forming a barrier around the city. Not long after, many rack ships piled up in the harbor. After completing the task, the clone of the dwarf master god disappeared, and all of them merged back into a clone. The surging dark waves crashed against the barrier, finally revealing its hidden loftiness. Due to the resistance, the undercurrents lurking under the surface of the sea continued to rise along the bubble barrier, forming huge waves as high as dozens of stories. However, the seemingly fragile bubble barrier was exceptionally sturdy. When the huge waves hit it, it was as if they had hit a rock, turning into white bubbles and falling into the sea. Outside King's Landing City, Snyder, who had just returned to the Ramsey continent by teleportation, heaved a sigh of relief. He managed to make it back in time and prevented the situation from getting out of hand. Some elemental shamans from the expeditionary army were teleported back together with the steampunk half-lich. These people were originally just a reserve team, ready to fill the manpower gap in the Steam City. But now they all had more urgent tasks. The great tsunami is coming. Snyder tore off the robe wrapped around his body, revealing his metal body, which was made of refined gold and mithril. On his square-shaped head, the exposed gears clicked together, and the steam whistle behind his head let out a whine. "Mobilize your elemental spirit." Do your best to appease the uneasiness and anger of this sea and divert their attention." Following the order, the elemental shamans of the camels and polar bear men immediately took action. Some immediately inserted the totem poles they carried with them into the soil on the shore and began to chant incantations to communicate with the elemental spirit. Others followed Snyder's example and tore off their robes, jumped straight into the slightly cold sea, and instantly turned into super-large elemental creatures. These elemental shamans who had turned into elemental creatures were led by an elderly female who had turned into a water djinn. She was a hybrid leader of walrus and polar bear men in the island world. At this time, she had turned into a powerful water djinn with smooth green skin and deep blue eyes. She wore a necklace made of the skull of a hard-headed trout and pearls. Generally speaking, most adult water djinns were 16 feet tall and weighed about 2,500 pounds. But this water djinn, who had turned into an elemental shaman, was obviously of noble lineage. She was more than 20 feet tall, but even so, she could still stand firmly on the surface of the water without any sign of sinking. This was the talent of the water djinn. Like a mainstay, this elemental shaman took the lead and rushed toward the waves coming from the intersection of the sea and the sky. Two sharp teeth, which came from the walrus bloodline, protruded from her upper jaw. At first glance, she looked a little ferocious. Water manipulation. After turning into a water djinn, controlling the water flow seemed to be an instinct. She quickly disturbed the direction of the water flow within a few miles in front of her. The surging waves also rolled to the sides with the water flow, instead of rushing directly to the defensive line on the shore. The other shamans who had turned into elemental creatures also showed their magic. Some of the shamans who had transformed into water elemental elders dove into the waves and used their bodies to drive more waves, forcibly changing the direction of part of the waves and allowing them to collide with the following waves on their own. Some shamans who had turned into water elemental creatures erected totem poles in the surging wave. Compared to their companions on the shore, they were more adept at mobilizing the elemental spirits in this water area. With the joint efforts of the elemental shamans, the momentum of the tsunami was temporarily restrained. When it hit the harbor of King's Landing City, the waves, which were originally as high as dozens of stories, had shrunk to a height of only a dozen feet. The damage caused was undoubtedly much smaller. While commanding the spellcasters, the steampunk Demolic was also trying hard to recite a tedious spell. If he wanted to use a legendary level spell, he couldn't make any mistakes. He constantly grabbed a handful of magic material powder from the storage compartment on his metal body and threw it into the spell model that was gradually taking shape in front of him. Finally, when Snade finally finished all the preparation work, he immediately stretched out his mechanical palm and pushed it forward. The model that was emitting strong magic waves suddenly dissipated. The spell set by the legendary Demolic immediately merged with the world, silently changing the power of all kinds of rules in the environment within a radius of hundreds of miles. Hundreds of miles away from King's Landing City, dozens of tiny but shining ice cores suddenly appeared. They were the ice cores that Snyder had created using the extremely precious ice chips from Zeus Kerr's core. The extreme cold instantly froze a large area of seawater, forming towering glaciers floating on the surface of the sea. Unlike ordinary glaciers which were in the form of a mixture of ice and water, the glaciers constructed using the body of an abomination were completely frozen from the bottom of the sea to the tip. Before the spell effect ended, these glaciers would continue to freeze. The heat in the surrounding seawater was constantly transferred to these ice cores, and the transfer of heat caused the water flow to change. Most of the waves that were about to rush towards King's Landing City were forcibly separated and turned towards these glaciers, where they froze. When the spell lost its effect, these glaciers would not be able to hold on for long before being broken by the subsequent wave. Then, like large pieces of ice, they would be pushed forward by the waves, tearing apart the northern coastline of the Ramsey continent. In this way, a large part of the destructive energy contained in the tsunami was once again disintegrated. By the time it reached King's Landing City, the tsunami that was originally comparable to the destruction of heaven and earth had become much lighter, and was no longer a threat to the majestic city. To be honest, this flow of glaciers was even more dangerous than a tsunami. However, under Snade's careful calculations, the final location of these glaciers cutting into the Ramsey continent was at least 2,000 miles away from King's Landing City. In the end, a Demolic was a Demolic. One could not expect him to have the character of a paladin. He was willing to harm others for his own benefit. As the epicenter of this disaster that affected most of the Ramsey Plain, the situation on Dwarf Island was actually very bad. However, just like the wind speed in the eye of a storm, it was much lower than the outside world. Although the expeditionary army of King's Landing City that landed on the island suffered from the shock waves, they did not suffer from the terrifying natural disasters that had accumulated and escalated further. Even the huge steel fleet that stopped a few miles away from Dwarf Island did not suffer from the disaster. Of course, it was inevitable that a few ships would capsize, but a large flagship like the Eastern Xiongwei was still in good condition. This was due to the powerful magic barrier on the ship, the timely response of the crew, and the timely rescue of the Leviathan airships. As an airship that was half biological and half mechanical, the Leviathan airship was much more flexible and adaptable than ordinary steel ships in the face of natural disasters. For example, the Nephremon Dis, which was assisting Neru in controlling the behemoth, had teleported away from the battle zone of Steam City before the shock waves arrived. He directly dived to the bottom of the sea and extended a tentacle-like rope to help the Eastern Xiongwei stabilize its center of gravity in the wave. However, this did not mean that the expeditionary army of King's Landing City did not suffer any damage. Some of the troops that landed on the island did not even have time to retreat to the open area and were directly buried under the collapsed rubble. The officers and marines wearing the fanatic armor were still fine. They could withstand a certain amount of damage and save themselves. However, if ordinary soldiers were buried under the rubble, even if they did not die, they would be seriously injured. Chapter 859. The Emperor had finally escaped from the heavens. He was blown out of the bowl-shaped arena by the hurricane. The Saint Samurai who chased after him, faced with a rare natural disaster, had to choose to save their own lives in the end, even though they had the intention to continue chasing. Under the protection of Jensen and the two Blazing Templars, the Paladins managed to survive the violent shockwave. When the storm subsided, they were surrounded by gravel, rubble, strange ointment jars, boilers, and instruments. It was like the scene after an impromptu ritual. There were many broken offerings piled up on the ground. Although this was only a small part of Steam City, it was not impossible to see how tragic the catastrophe was. Buried under the ruins, 9 out of 10 of the Emperor's bones had been shattered by the violent shock wave. But he was still conscious, and as soon as the disaster subsided, he gathered his thoughts. Ho ho ho! Bah! While laughing hysterically like a jackal, he spat out sticky sputum with traces of blood in his mouth. The Emperor gathered his strength and wanted to use the advanced teleportation spell to leave this dangerous place immediately. There are hundreds of thousands of monsters in Steam City, enough to keep you busy for a while, he thought maliciously. And that damn reptile, I'm afraid it's being bitten by Stim like a mad dog. At this time, he just wanted to leave Dwarf Island as soon as possible and retreat to the Ramsey continent. When he got there, he would wait and see. If Stim killed the reptile, then he could continue to stir up trouble in the Ramsey continent. If Stim was killed by Stim, then Keys would most likely suffer a great loss. He could also escape from this plane without worrying about being hunted down for a while. It was a pity that even though the Emperor had a good plan, the development of the situation did not go according to the script in his heart. When the effect of advanced teleportation gradually dissipated, This guy was preparing to cast a spell to repair the damage on his body. The damage caused by the group of sacred samurai, coupled with the subsequent blast wave, had almost killed him. But at this moment, there was a sonorous sound behind the Emperor's head. Someone had attacked him. Who dares? Because of his injuries, the Emperor was a little slow in dodging, and a war hammer hit him squarely on the shoulder. With just this one attack, his entire arm was ground to dust. The Emperor, who was both shocked and furious, looked up. A sturdy dwarf with a cold and stern appearance, wrapped in chainmail, had suddenly appeared behind him without him noticing. This guy's brown eyes flashed with anger called hatred. He held a war hammer in one hand and a round shield in the other. The way he looked at the king was as if he was looking at his mortal enemy. Galdar! The Emperor could not help but exclaim. It turned out that the person who appeared in front of him was Galdar Ironhand, the god of protection of the dwarf divine system, who was also known as Stern and Shield of the Golden Hills. Or to be more precise, this was an avatar of a god with the same level of divine power as Stim, both of them being lesser gods, but with a higher combat prowess. Damn monster! After receiving the order from the Lord God, even though Galdar did not blame him for the death of millions of dwarfs on Dwarf Island in the Ramsey Plain, due to his own domain, Galdar still felt deeply guilty for not being able to fulfill his duty as a guardian. In his mind, the Emperor was already at the top of the must-kill list. Stern God's hatred for him had already surpassed that of some of the gods in the Earth Spirit system and Kobold God system. The most obvious manifestation of this was that as a god of the lawful good camp, Galdar could not help but swing his war hammer at the Emperor when he saw him, even though he did not like to attack his opponents secretly. However, because his war hammer was called Hammer of Song, every swing would be accompanied by a sonorous sound wave attack. So, strictly speaking, the strike just now was not a sneak attack. However, once Galdar attacked, he was merciless and smashed the Emperor's entire arm into meat paste. This was also in line with his name of Ironhand. Seeing that he did not kill this villain with one strike, Galdar's avatar became furious. He pushed the shield of the Golden Hills forward with his left hand. With this round shield as the center, a visible ripple of force field instantly rippled out. The Emperor wanted to retreat, but his ankle suddenly broke with a "kacha" sound. It turned out that this was the mind stimulation wave that Galdar was famous for. The ripple of force field was just a disguise, just like other dwarfs who were good at using illusions. The real killer was actually the god who used his power to cause damage to the target. Because dwarfs were small in size, Galdar, as their god of guard, had always taught them to pay special attention to attacking the legs of tall opponents. The Emperor, who was wearing the skin of Wendigo, did not notice and had his ankle broken by Galdar's divine power. And because of the characteristics of divine power, the injury he suffered could not be healed unless Galdar died. Even if he was lucky enough to escape today, and then used a secret technique to reincarnate and change his skin, the injury of his broken leg would still work on his new body. But how could Galdar let him go today? The great Lord God had already told him that today, he sent his avatar to the Ramsey Plain to kill this scourge once and for all when the Emperor was severely injured. Time illusion! Geldal exclaimed. In an instant dozens of figures appeared around him. Each of them was himself at a node in the future or the past that he temporarily extracted from the long river of time with his divine power. The moment these Sterners were summoned, they immediately understood the reason why they were here. They were all enraged by the sins that the Emperor had committed against the dwarf race. They all picked up their hammers and round shields and chased after the crippled enemy. Take the bamboo shoot. The familiar recipe, the familiar smell. Dozens of avatars of gods rushed toward him together. The Emperor felt that this was worse than being surrounded and beaten by those sacred warriors not long ago. If he was in his heyday, he might still have a way to turn the situation around. Even if he could not beat them, he could still run away. but now he was an arrow at the end of its flight. It was even a little difficult for him to use advanced teleportation. So, this ambitious person tried his best to resist for a moment, but in the end, he was knocked down to the ground by the time illusion of those gods. Dozens of divine weapons, hammers of song, fell on the Emperor's body like pounding rice. The Emperor collapsed. Chapter 860. After admiring Stim's ferocious maneuvers, Keyes couldn't help but inwardly click his tongue. It was fortunate that he didn't deactivate his quantum form, or he would have been the unlucky one to take the brunt of the maniacal god's attacks head-on. Now, it was the land that was taking the blame for him. Under the full power of the god of virtual games avatar, the swirling plains in the heart of Dwarf Island bore the brunt of his attacks, and had now become a new basin. Large amounts of underground water gushed out, mixing with the flames and magma in other places, producing incessant hissing sounds. There was no trace of the country house and farm that the distinguished dwarves of Steam City had built here. Only some crumbling walls were left, as if telling of what had happened here. After spending most of the divine power in his body, Keyes, who had been hiding for long enough, finally broke free from his quantum state. The young blue dragon returned to the material plane, ready to do his best to eradicate the mad god. However, someone was one step ahead of him. A glittering cloud of gold dust suddenly appeared out of thin air, spiraling over the heavily damaged land. The golden cloud seemed to exist unreal, and then turned into a glittering dwarf. It was a handsome dwarf with golden skin, and the hue of his eyes was forever changing. Beneath his flowing silk cloak was a chainmail armor that looked like it was made of gold, and in his hand was a huge axe that didn't match his figure. He was gar-dazzling. Moreover, unlike the usual bright coal, sacrificial image of the gods, the chief god of the dwarves had sent out his own battle avatar. The double-edged axe in his hand was a heaven-sent weapon called Arundina. Usually, this weapon with its own intelligence was addressed as a female, acting as both Gar's weapon and Gar's close friend. The glittering Arundina could easily split stones as if they were just air, and easily break through metal armor as if it didn't exist. Carrying the axe, Gar had convinced more than one god who had been pranked by him to put aside their anger and smile. That was why Arundina was also known as the Defender. However, Gar-dazzling wasn't here to defend his prank today. The dwarf god was really angry this time. The actions of the god of virtual games, Stim, had provoked the father of dwarves and king of the Golden Hills, and he had made up his mind to destroy the scum of the dwarven gods. Without a word, Gar-dazzling's battle avatar turned into a breeze and lunged at Stim. At the moment, in preparation for Keyes' attack, the god of virtual games had turned his avatar into the appearance of the demon king Chong-ji, a new form that the emperor had helped him to obtain, and in Gar-dazzle's view, that was enough to be called deviant. Looking at the burly demon in gorgeous armor, his sharp claws covered with rock skin, and the fiery red horns on his head coiled like a crown, Garl Glittergold felt a burst of anger for no reason. "What kind of dwarf are you?" As the dwarf god roared, the sun in the sky suddenly burst into a dazzling halo. The ground of the Swirl Plains, now the Swirl Basin, trembled incessantly as golden vines broke out of the ground and surged to the surface. In addition to being a dwarf, as a great divine power, Garl Dazzling Gold also had many different fields of clergy. Sun, earth element, plant, order, healing, illusion, deception, trade, and so on. Therefore, when the emotions of this battle clone were fully aroused, all of his divine domain exerted some influence on the physical world, and this was only one clone of Gar's Dazzling Gold. That was why the exalted god had forbidden the true form of God to set foot on the physical plane, and that was the reason why the exalted god had forbidden his true form to set foot on the physical plane. As a bystander, Keyes was at a loss for what to do with the sudden change. The dwarf god had interfered and snatched the script that should have belonged to him. However, just as Sui Xiong was wondering if he should help, A faint voice suddenly sounded in the mind of the young blue dragon. Don't resist. Prepare to teleport. Before he could finish his sentence, Quest felt the world spinning around him. Although he would not have such a strange feeling if he used a high-level teleportation spell, how could other people's spells be completely suitable for him? In particular, teleporting a giant beast like him, whose body was so huge that there was no suitable classification to describe it, required a huge amount of energy. How could it be so easy to precisely control it? Fortunately, the dizziness did not last long. When Keys came back to his senses, he found himself on a rocky ground. The steel-like blue sun emitted a dim light, and a vast plain was separated by jagged rocky mountains everywhere. The strange ponds near them were roughly covered by them. This was obviously not the scene on Dwarf Island, and it was unlikely that they were still in the Ramsey Plain. We've come to Stim's divine kingdom. Keys looked over and saw a small figure floating in the air, looking at him. He was wearing a platinum priest's robe, and a smoldering coal was attached to a necklace in front of his chest. He was also the incarnation of Guard Dazzling Gold. However, unlike the non-mainstream bandit battle incarnation in the Ramsey Plain, the one that appeared in front of the young blue dragon was a bright coal priest incarnation. Great Lord of the Golden Hills. Keys did not underestimate him because of his small stature, and he respectfully greeted Guard Dazzling Gold's incarnation. Guard Dazzling Gold nodded. My army of petitioners, the Blade of Arundina, is reforming the petitioners in Stim's divine kingdom. Although he did not explain the specific method of conversion, Keys could guess that there was more to it than words. And this incarnation of mine has been deceiving the god of virtual games, so that he does not realize that his divine kingdom is under attack. This prank has been going on for decades. Keys could not help but be shocked by the dwarf god's words. The young blue dragon could not help but sigh. Great divine powers were indeed ridiculously powerful, and their might was not something that mortals or lesser divine powers could imagine. Now, it's time for this show to come to an end. As he spoke, the coal that was smoldering in front of Guard Dazzling Gold's chest suddenly shone with a dazzling radiance that even the blue sun in the sky could not compare. The divine kingdom and the gods are one and the same. The sun here is the energy engine of Stim's virtual games, the jagged peaks here are his processing nodes, the pools here are the products of his virtual games. The power of the gods has its limits, and I cannot destroy the products of his divine order, but he is indeed sinful. The bright coal priest's incarnation abruptly ignited, turning into specks of gold that disappeared into Stim's divine kingdom. Therefore, I am willing to pay the price of an incarnation to completely block his senses. I command thee, the most powerful of mortals, to completely destroy Stim and his divine kingdom, cutting off any possibility of revival for this scum of the dwarven pantheon. Chapter 861. And then? Hundreds of years after Keys's reputation as the God-Slayer spread, several scholars who were dedicated to the study of the history of the scale of perpetual order gathered around a small round table, listening attentively to a lecture by a Ph.D. scholar. They were all employees of the scale of perpetual order. Since they were having lunch and had nothing to do, it wouldn't hurt to talk about those legends. Hearing the urging of his colleagues, the scholar with a heart-shaped bun on his head smiled. Storytellers have to set traps, or else how can I get you to treat me next time? I'll have to whet your appetite first. Lowering their heads, the scholar's colleagues exchanged glances. Without further ado, they picked up the scholar and walked towards the door of the restaurant. There were still hundreds of scrolls that needed to be copied and categorized in the afternoon, so it would be great if they could get a helper. What are you doing? I haven't finished eating yet. We're just whetting your appetite too. Of course, this was a story for another time. When Keys returned to the Ramsey Plain, the truth about the fall of the god of virtual games had become a case without any lead. Moreover, there were indeed some gods and ambitious gods who wanted to inherit the virtual game's divine title that Stim had vacated. But no matter what they tried, they were unable to condense that divine title again. Based on logical inference, some people proposed some hypotheses. For example, Keys had directly killed his way into Stim's divine kingdom on the day Dwarf Island sank. This terrifyingly powerful Megalosaurus might have been the God Slayer, who wanted to prevent the gods from becoming complacent. Not only did Keys kill the god's true form, but he also destroyed the divine kingdom that represented his divine title. However, Keys had never admitted that he had done this. He had never admitted that on that day, he had destroyed the mountains and rivers of Stim's divine kingdom with his colossal body. He had never admitted that on that day, he had swallowed all the fragments of the divine kingdom that could be digested into his stomach. He had never admitted that on that day, Gar's dazzling gold had a nervous and surprised expression when he saw him swallowing the fragments of the divine kingdom without restraint. He had never admitted that on that day, he had released more than 30 quantum breaths in an extravagant manner, completely wiping out all the fragments of the divine kingdom that could not be digested from the very concept of it. However, from that day onwards, the gnome god Gar Dazzling Gold seemed to have changed his temperament. He had sternly warned every gnome god in the Golden Hills more than once, including the god of evil and greed, Erdlian, who was not very obedient to his teachings. In the future, remember not to mention the name of the Megalosaurus in the list of pranks. There is definitely something wrong with that guy. Even some gods who were on good terms with Gar Dazzling Gold, such as the gods of the Yodaha divine system and the Moradin divine system, and the god of luck Tamora, had all received some short messages from the gnome god. As for the gods who were not on good terms with him, such as the gods of the Goblin divine system and the Kobold divine system, Gar Dazzling Gold did not deliberately create conflict between them and Keys. After all, he himself had said that he was not to play pranks on Keys. However, after learning that there were a large number of Erdlian Kobold Airmen and Dragonborn Kobolds in the scale of perpetual order, Gar Dazzling Gold felt that the remaining 3 gods of the Kobold divine system were probably in for a bad time. Fortunately, I did him a favor that day. When Stim's divine kingdom collapsed, the clone of the god of virtual games that he had left behind in the Ramsey Plain lost its foundation. The demon king Chongji, who was still desperately resisting Gar Dazzling Gold's non-mainstream heavy-armored bandit combat clone, instantly lost its backbone. The gnome god swung Arundina, the defender, and cut off its ugly head that looked like a demon but was many times larger. Having lost the blessing of his divine kingdom and his true form having fallen, Stim's demon king Chongji's clone was naturally deader than dead. However, for some reason, probably due to his divine domain of prophecy, which he had never admitted, Gar Dazzling Gold did not use his divine power to crush the demon king Chongji's divine body into dust. He mobilized his great divine power and cleansed this divine body again and again. After confirming that Stim and the Emperor's brand could not possibly exist, Gar Dazzling Gold actually reinstalled his head. After his fall, the divine body could no longer be described as he onto his body, and used his boundless great power to forcefully change the demon king Chongji's alignment. When Keys and the King's Landing Expeditionary Force returned in triumph, the demon king Chongji, who had become an absolute neutral like a construct, became the biggest and only prize that could be displayed in this punishment war. Later on, Keys transformed his flesh and blood into Leviathan, and in the end, his morale became another secret weapon of the scale of perpetual order. Since then, in the scale of perpetual order's trade with the inner elemental planes, the demon king Chongji appeared many times as a mediator or a security supervisor. Due to the deterrence of the demon king Chongji to the demons, although the demons themselves were born from the demons, the various demons actually fed on the demons, and the demon king Chongji was a great demon king who stood at the top of the ranks of all demons. Therefore, those unruly demons would give him some face and would not dare to go too far. Therefore, the great gift that Dazzling Gold gave to Keys was not only valuable, but also very useful. It was enough to show his sincerity. In return, in the second year after the end of the expedition, King's Landing City took the initiative to establish a reciprocal trade alliance with a small country in the outer sea. King's Landing City took the initiative to become the agent of those aquatic midgets, buying the products of Coral City at a rather sincere price and selling them throughout the Ramsey continent. At the same time, King's Landing City also sent the land products that the aquatic midgets needed at a very low price. As for Keys, because he had swallowed a god's divine kingdom, although he had just entered the age of a young megalosaurus, he had fallen into a state similar to dragon sleep. However, fortunately, he had the experience of digesting the astral slug raised by Stim, so he transformed himself into a quantum state in time. It only took a year or two for him to completely wake up. Ash's world, Dragonkin territory. Due to the deliberate management of the scale of perpetual order, this territory, which was originally formed by a few kobold Dragonkin clans, had developed rapidly in the past few decades. In addition to some merchants from this plane who would come here to trade, even some merchants from other planes would come here to sell goods or purchase some specialties of the Ash's world. In short, the Dragonkin territory was like a pearl in the Ash's world. However, although it was located in the hinterland of the Medici Empire, it had no subordinate relationship with the Empire at all. Chapter 862. In Bite City of the Medici Empire, this year's Opat festival had just ended. Pharaoh, who had just ascended the throne, was still busy browsing through the various data compiled by his attendants. When the Pasha of each province came to the capital to report on their duties, they brought with them a summary of the tax and trade situation. Your Majesty Mako. An attendant quickly walked up to the young pharaoh, knelt on one knee, and presented a stack of papyrus-bound account books. This is a summary of the various commercial and civil data of Nome's special province. After verification, the proportion of agricultural tax in the province this year has dropped by 30%, and the commercial tax has nearly doubled. The growth rate is the fastest among all the provinces in the empire. Pharaoh took the account book and flipped through it. If there is really a problem, can it be solved with just a few pieces of paper? Mako could not help but twitch his mouth, but he still asked. Food is one of the foundations of the country. Nome's special province is densely populated. If it needs to buy food from the neighboring provinces, will it cause an overall shortage of food in the empire? The attendant who had been following Pharaoh since the beginning of his seclusion, how could he not understand the meaning behind the young ruler's words? But out of loyalty and professional ethics, he still decided to tell the truth. Your Majesty, this is absolutely impossible. In fact, the reason why agricultural tax in Nome's special province has dropped is actually because the Megalosaurus Pasha has reduced the proportion of agricultural tax by 70%. And under such circumstances, the total agricultural tax in the province has only dropped by 30% compared to the year before, which means that the total food production of Nome has actually increased a lot compared to before. Hearing this, Mako knew that he could not find fault in this matter, so he waved his hand and dismissed the attendant. The young pharaoh sat upright on the throne. The light of the eternal blaze shone through the transparent crystal dome of the audience hall, covering the king's figure in a bright light curtain. No one could see the expression on his face. You're really raising a tiger. Just as Mako was secretly angry, a series of squeaking noises that sounded like the gnawing of insects suddenly rang out in the audience hall. Pharaoh immediately suppressed his thoughts. After all, someone had come to visit him. Of course, it was a stretch to say that the visitor was a human. Like a broken mirror, a flaming red humanoid creature suddenly appeared in the audience hall. Her figure was similar to a human's, but her face looked like a mix between an insect and a reptile. She had 4 strong arms and wore a sleeveless plate armor that seemed to be made of obsidian. She was a Sill who lived in the Ether realm. The Sirs were the scourge of the realm of Ether. They wanted to conquer everything they came into contact with. In order to make their race last for generations, they did not hesitate to sacrifice others. All Serenes were females who could lay eggs, but they needed a living host to hatch their eggs. They used the hidden oviducts in their mouthparts to inject eggs into the bodies of paralyzed targets. Although they looked strange and evil, and acted more like wild beasts and barbarians, the Sirs, who could travel between planes with the help of the Ether realm, were actually very intelligent. They had a totalitarian culture and saw all other races as incubation tanks, or potential incubation tanks. But among the many creatures, they especially loved monsters like the phase spiders. Your Majesty Mako. After descending from the Ether realm to the material plane, the Sill immediately bent down and bowed deeply to Pharaoh, who was sitting in the middle of the audience hall, to express her respect and friendliness. You are Chuck Chuck. Although it was not the first time they had met, it was still difficult for humans to distinguish a Sill from her appearance. The young pharaoh had to look at the inscriptions engraved on the Sill's plate armor to identify her. Didn't I ask the queen for a note? Without permission, all diplomatic envoys of Sirs have to report to the Foreign Affairs Registration Office in Bite City first before they can come to meet you. As he spoke, a surge of magic waves gushed out of the pharaoh's body. After Keys killed the previous pharaoh, the Medici Empire did not confer a new Grand Vader. Instead, they used the Obsidian Council to collect the treasures of the previous Grand Vader and used most of them on themselves. Under the heavy pressure, the Sill envoy trembled with fear. Your Majesty, please forgive me. If not for the lack of sweat glands, Chuck Chuck would have sweated profusely. I have no choice but to visit. After all, we can't leak any information about the assault task force. So it's because of this. Mako understood. In the beginning, the Medici Empire and the Sill had no contact with each other. However, after taking over most of the overseas territories of the Neon Empire, some races from other planes who used to trade slaves with the Neon Empire all hoped to establish contact with Medici. Among them, a large number of slaves were imported from the Neon Empire as incubators in the realm of Ether. Although the Medici Empire abolished slavery in the era of the Hero King, due to the great expansion of their territory, in order to maintain the stability of their rule, they did not ban the slave trade in the overseas territories of the Neon Empire. However, they also set a 10-year deadline for this. Before the death of the previous pharaoh, the slave trade was completely stopped at the official level. Originally, the trade between the Sill and the Ashes world should have been stopped. However, these evil races in the realm of Ether had some friction with the scale of perpetual order in the Ashes world because of the hunting rights of monsters like the phase spiders. It turned out that with the expansion of the scale of trade, monsters like the phase spiders, which could carry items between the material plane and the realm of Ether, were quickly selected by the scale of perpetual order as special beasts of burden. This rich and powerful chamber of commerce not only directly encircled the land, but also set out to build some domestication and breeding bases in the material plane like the Ashes world to cultivate some special phase spiders from young. There was no doubt that the operation of the scale of perpetual order angered the Sill, who had always regarded the phase spiders as their own rice. A few years ago, they had raised an army and carried out a large-scale siege on the Chamber of Commerce's ranch in the realm of Ether. However, at that time, Keys had just digested Stim's god's kingdom. The young blue dragon, who had woken up from a daze, wanted to move his body and find a place to solve the problem of food. He could not always eat in the Ramsey plane. Otherwise, with Keys' body size, if he let go of his stomach, no matter how many supergiant monsters there were in that plane, it would not be enough for him to eat. He directly broke into the vast realm of ether and intervened in the Chamber of Commerce's 3-year ranch defense war. There was no suspense in the outcome. When this terrible megalosaurus opened its mouth and ate and drank to its heart's content, the Sill population, which had once been all over the realm of ether, directly decreased by nearly 1/10, and the queen changed 3 times. For this reason, some elemental apostles, who had been fighting this evil creature in the realm of ether for a long time, deliberately contacted the scale of perpetual order and conveyed some gratitude from some kind gods. Since then, although the Sill no longer dared to fight against the scale of perpetual order on the surface, they had secretly regarded the Chamber of Commerce and Keys as their mortal enemies. These evil creatures with ulterior motives were always thinking about how to make trouble for the scale of perpetual order and cause some damage. Of course, they did not dare to go too far. If they attacked the large-scale ranches in the realm of ether again, who knew how many queens would have to be replaced? Therefore, they set their sights on the scale of perpetual order's breeding base in the world of ashes. And it was precisely because of this that the Sill once again secretly established contact with Medicus Pharaoh Mako. After all, they had already asked around. That terrible megalosaurus seemed to be the vassal of this pharaoh. The Nome region that he was in charge of was a special province of Medicus. Chapter 863. As a race of the Order Evil Alignment, the Seer rarely carried out important military operations without proper preparation. If they wanted to carry out a surgical operation on the scales of eternal order in the Ash world, they naturally had to be very careful in their assessment. In the past few years, the Seer had spent a lot of wealth looted from the realm of ether to support Mako, who was hostile to the scale of perpetual order, to ascend to the throne of Pharaoh. They had even helped Mako, who was still in hiding, to assassinate a few of his brothers. What the Sirens wanted in return was more accurate information and information about the Scales of Eternity Merchant Guild that Pharaoh Mako could obtain as Pharaoh Mako. Out of a common goal, the monarch of the Medici Empire had also hinted that he would provide some cover for the Seer's actions when necessary. After all, how could he allow others to sleep beside him? As long as the Nomote province and the Dragonborn clan dominion existed in the Medici Empire, the supreme authority that he, the pharaoh, should have in this land would be challenged. But even so, the Seer, who had faced the horror of the young blue dragon, did not act rashly. In fact, in recent years, other than contacting Mako from time to time, they had not carried out any specific actions. So much so that the young pharaoh had begun to suspect that these strange creatures with 4 arms had given up halfway, or were they seriously procrastinating? Of course, the answer to this question was no. How could the vengeful Seer forget the suffering that Keys and the Scale of Perpetual Order had caused them? The reason why they did not take action was that they had been waiting for a sharp knife to be sharpened. In the realm of Hadis, known as the Grey Wilderness, 333 ghost nannies and green nannies gathered around a taller leader of the night nannies and were listening to the preaching before the ceremony. "We have no choice," the nannies, who had lavender skin, a sharp nose, and a pair of angular ram horns on her head, said loudly. "If we can't create a powerful Altoros demon, then we will no longer be able to resist the abominable the scale of perpetual order. All our existing larvae and soul prisms trade will be destroyed." Although there was no friendship between the Anababas, and this unique Anababas named Shanka, compared to the other Anababas who wore ragged clothes and had a skinny appearance, Shanka not only had a plump figure, but also a beautiful face that did not resemble a Anababas at all, had been the target of their jealousy for many years. However, her words still resonated with all the Anababas who attended this gathering. Even if they did not want to admit it, Shanka was indeed the most successful rising star of the nannies in the past few hundred years. Her most legendary experience was that she had used her beauty to charm Asopos, the Lord of Vengeance of the Glaiths, and successfully prevented her merchant group from being attacked by the Glaiths in the Grey Wilderness for no reason. Just this advantage alone allowed her to earn much more than many of her kind in the trade with the Yugalos of the scorching inferno. In the current environment where many nannies had to rely on the Yugoloths, Shanka was one of the few who could organize her own merchant group to compete with the Yugoloths. Every Anababa knows our history. Except for Lady Kaji Luna, the goddess of Anababa, we rarely attach ourselves to other gods. Why is that? Isn't it because we're proficient in creating powerful guardians? Weren't the Yugoloths, who prospered because of the bloody war, originally created by our ancestors to complete the contract with the Lord of the 9 prisons of Bader? Even the strongest of the Yugoloths, the Lord of the Yugoloths, the scorching inferno general, and the god of the Yugoloths, which one of them is not the Altoros that we created to protect ourselves? If translated into the language of the nannies, the so-called Altoros were actually champions. No one knew how the nannies came to understand the magic formula to transform the Yugoloths into super demons. Some people said that it was the goddess of the nannies, Kaji Luna, who developed it and used it as a tool for her followers to maintain their dominance in the Grey Wilderness. But in fact, anyone who had some understanding of the gods in the multiverse knew that Kaji Luna had never cared about the well-being of her descendant. The more likely situation was that a group of clever old nannies encountered a serious crisis and came up with the idea of a champion. No matter what the truth was, the nannies would not say it, and the Yugoloths would not even mention it. Both sides had good reasons to hide this matter well. For the nannies, creating an Altoros was extremely taxing. They had to voluntarily contribute part of their life essence. This would weaken them to a state of near powerlessness, and it would take months or even years for them to recover. If the news got out, there would be a lot of people preparing all kinds of weapons and taking advantage of their weakness to kill them. For the few Altoros, although there seemed to be no upper limit to their strength, it depended on the number of nannies who participated in the ritual and the proportion of their strength that they were willing to contribute. For example, in order to create the Scorching Inferno General, who was comparable to the Lord of Bader and some other powerful gods, it was said that more than 3,000 nannies participated in the ritual. However, according to the principle of equivalent exchange, the ritual was not only very strict, but also very strict. If there was a slight mistake, both the nannies who participated in the ritual and the Yugoloths who underwent the transformation would die. It was still a legend that in order to create the Scorching Inferno General, only 3 of the nannies who participated in the ritual survived. After the ritual was completed, the created Altoros had to obey the commands of their creators unconditionally until the time limit of the contract was reached. Except for a few smart Altoros demons, who used their superior wisdom to find some loopholes in the contracts that had been optimized for generations and regained their freedom, the rest of the Altoros demons were still working for the Anababas who created them for free. Even if they were many times more powerful than their creators, they still had to obey their command. What was even more frightening was that the Anababas were the weakness of the Altoros demons. As long as one of the Anababas who participated in the ritual and survived was killed, the Altoros demons that they created would also die. Therefore, for the sake of their own lives, the Altoros demons could only try their best to hide their Anababas in a secret place. If the Scorched General only hid 3 Anababas, it would be fine. However, if too many Anababas survived the ritual, the demon of Altoros would not be able to live in peace for the rest of his life. If he stood out too much, many people would start looking for his creator. Therefore, whether it was the Altoros demons or the Altoros demons, they would tacitly keep the ritual a secret. Often, only the most powerful and knowledgeable Altoros could learn the process of the ritual from some secret book. If she wanted to create another champion of her own, she had to gather and brainwash a group of other Altoros like Shanka. Under the condition of hiding the death rate of the ritual, she had to find a suitable way to make her fellow Altoros die in the process of the ritual. Chapter 864. After the speech, Shanka swayed her plump waist and slowly walked down the platform that was specially made for this speech. As her clothes fluttered, the lines of runes on the platform gradually faded away, and the traces of the magic circle were cleaned up. If she wanted to make the 300-odd ghost nannies obedient, how could she not use some tricks? In order to create an Altoros demon, the Anababas had gathered in the cave, surrounding a large bronze cauldron in the middle of the cauldron. As Shanka shouted, "Light the fire!" a few Anababas carefully carried a ball of demonic fire from Nessus, the lowest level of the 9 prisons of Bader, into the pile of demon bones under the cauldron. The cauldron was filled with water from the river Styx and rotting larvae. As the fire roasted, the water began to boil. More than 10 Anababas operated a crane and hoisted an iron cage above the cauldron. As soon as the rising green smoke came into contact with the iron cage, the metal was corroded, and the Yugoloth demon that was locked inside fell into the cauldron. The viscous liquid splashed out, but as if it had hit an invisible barrier, it all flowed back into the boiling cauldron. All the Anababas, including Shanka, either took out a ceremonial dagger or directly pierced the veins on their wrists with their sharp nails. Foul blood slowly dripped from the shriveled blood vessels to the ground. The blood seemed to be pulled by some kind of force, and began to squirm on the ground towards the cauldron. From this moment on, every Anababas had to concentrate on chanting the incantation, and the chanting time would take at least 6 months. Not only that, but as they voluntarily contributed their life essence, they would also slowly become weaker. Although the cave was very well hidden, many Anababas still released their nighthounds to protect themselves. Not only did they have to guard against other creatures in the grey wilderness, but they also had to worry about their own kind. As the ritual went on, the pot of soup in the cauldron gradually dried up. After 5 months of boiling, the Yugoloth demon that was thrown into the cauldron had melted into nothing. The evil spirit and the soup inside had now turned into a wax-like substance. The large cauldron made of bronze had turned a demonic red after being heated for a long time. During this time, all of the Anababas were extremely tired and weak. Only Shanka, who was the strongest among them, still had the strength to move. Now, she was the only one who still had the strength to tear off the wings of some fiery demon bats that she had prepared beforehand and throw them into the flames below the cauldron to stabilize the temperature of the demonic fire. However, this was all she could do. Originally, she still had the strength to help some of the Anababas chase away their Nidhus hounds, which had started to bite their owners due to extreme hunger. But since the beginning of this month, she didn't have the energy to care about these trivial matters. The life essence of any ghost nanny killed by the night hound would be instantly sucked away by the cauldron. The remaining corpse, which had more bones than flesh, became dog food for all the night hounds, filling the stomachs of these murderers who did not have a single strand of hair on their bodies. After all, if they were fed, they could at least ensure that there would be sufficient guards for a period of time. By the time the 7th month had passed, none of the ghost nannies were still standing. They were all sprawled on the ground all over the place. But even so, they didn't stop chanting the incantation. Shanka, the leader of the night ghost army, had not even blinked for the past 7 months. Now, she was staring at the cauldron with her blood-red eyes, which were about to go blind from exhaustion. Almost there, she kept chanting. There was no more blood to flow out of her veins, but Shanka's spirit was extremely high at this time, because when she added the fiery demon bats to the cauldron, she found that the wax in the cauldron had not only all turned black, but there were also cracks on it. This meant that the Altoros demon was about to break out of its cocoon. "It's coming out." Seeing numerous cracks suddenly appear on the red cauldron, Shanka's heart suddenly jumped to her throat. The leader of the Night Ghost Granny Battle Group didn't even think about it. She had practiced countless times 7 months ago, so her muscles remembered. She immediately reached out to pull off an earring from her ear, and quickly crushed the gem on it. In a flash, Shanka disappeared from her original position next to the cauldron and appeared behind all the Anababas. Many nighthounds, who had lost their masters and wandered around wantonly and harbored malicious intentions, immediately surrounded her. However, the leader of the night ghost army did not even bother to look at them, because a blazing light was emitting from the cracks on the cauldron. Bang! A huge explosion sounded, and the sound reflected back and forth in the cave that was sealed by the Anababa's spells. Fortunately, the cave did not collapse. Before her voice could reach them, the bronze cauldron had already shattered into countless pieces. Countless pieces of metal and wax flew towards the Anababas who had gathered around the cauldron. Not to mention that these Anababas were now extremely weak. Even if they were as energetic as they were 7 months ago, they were still too weak to face the inevitable explosion ceremony that would inevitably accompany the birth of the Altoros demon. Therefore, almost all the Anababas who participated in the ceremony died in the violent explosion, or were torn apart by the shock wave or flying metal residue. Only Shanka was an exception. Just right, ha ha. The leader of the night ghost army was thrown to the ground by the explosion. When she got up, she coughed out a small pool of internal organs, but she still let out a wild laughter that sounded like the howling of an owl. This attracted the attention of the surviving nighthounds, and these big evil dogs began to slowly surround Shanka. However, the night ghost army did not care at all, because her champion fighter had already been born. Not to mention these nighthounds, even if a powerful demigod-like existence were to come here now, they would not be able to hurt her at all. Not to mention, she was good at scheming. When she prepared the Yugalos for the ceremony, she specially selected an individual with great potential. Joel Lek. Shanka roared. Then, a white whirlwind appeared around her. As the whirlwind subsided, the nighthounds, who were originally drooling and surrounding the leader of the night ghost army, were all turned into piles of scattered meat. And on every piece of meat on the ground, there were traces of being torn by sharp teeth. A giant gnoll demon that was more than 10 feet tall, even with its back hunched, stood in front of Shanka. Although he had the appearance of a gnoll, his face was actually more like a hyena's. His fur was also covered with armor made of pale bones. It had 4 arms, each of which did not have a palm at the front. Instead, it was connected to the head of a hyenodon. However, what was really amazing about this newly born Altoros demon was not its appearance. In fact, after being transformed by the Anababas, only a few Altoros demons would retain the typical appearance of a Yugalos. The Anababas would give full play to their imagination and creativity when creating them. It was the name that Shanka had just mentioned. Go-Lai Liku had once possessed unparalleled glory. Chapter 865. Joel Lek was once a god. He was a god in decline. In the prehistoric era, this god was at least a weak god, but because the gnolls turned to the giant gods, and then because of the rise of Yeenagu, Joel Lek was ruthlessly abandoned by the gnolls. In fact, this also had something to do with the laziness of this god. In the early Gnoll myths, Joel Lek never bothered to dress himself as the creator of the race, so no god could play this role in front of the gnolls. In addition, the nature of the gnolls, they simply worshipped strength and power. After the rise of Yeenagu, the ability of the priest of the Abyss Lord was far stronger than the shaman who worshipped Joel Lek. Although in the first few generations of the gnolls, he did teach the gnoll shaman how to charm and control hyenas and use them for hunting, but now this ability was not an indispensable talent for the gnoll clan. Therefore, it was not surprising that he had declined. As the belief of this primitive god faded out of the gnoll clan, he also became increasingly dependent on the form of animal totems. Because when he wandered in the noisy tunnel and the bottomless abyss, this form was not easy to attract attention. Otherwise, those Flinder gnolls who worshipped Yeenagu would have reported his appearance to their new god immediately. In the past few hundred years, Yeenagu had attacked Joel Lek more than once, trying to completely kill the remaining divine power of the ancient Knoll god. Moreover, this Knoll king of the Abyss, who was also the Lord of the Abyss, also used this method to educate his people. Natural selection, survival of the fittest. The replacement of the leader of the Knoll clan was now also accompanied by blood and violence. In order to avoid the pursuit of Yeenoghu, Gol, Lek had no choice but to gradually deviate from the camp and try to survive in other neutral or lawful planes. That was how he came to the Grey Wilderness. In the Hades dimension, he had used up all of his remaining divine power to mold himself into a Yugoloth demon. Then, he had completely faded into an ordinary being. However, as described before, divine power was a great power that had the ability to change reality. After using divine power to transform himself into a Yugoloth demon, Gol, Lek really became a Yugoloth demon. He had the body of a Yugoloth demon and the way of thinking of a Yugoloth demon. Surviving in the Hades plane was not a bad way to recuperate. Moreover, after meeting the ambitious leader of the Night Hag army, Shanka, Gol, Lek also got the opportunity to become stronger again, transforming into an Altoros demon. Compared with worrying about being killed by Yeenoghu all day, following the command of a Night Hag, which was not so unacceptable for the desperate situation. Therefore, the two of them, who hit it off, jointly planned this transformation ceremony. Shanka was responsible for bewitching a sufficient number of Hag to participate in the transformation ceremony, and Gol Lek signed the most stringent Altoros Hag contract with the former. After he became him again, he must always unconditionally obey Shanka's request. He could not hide this Hag behind the scenes like the previous Altoros demons and enjoy the power brought by this power alone. Moreover, he had to use all his knowledge and means to promote Shanka, the leader of the Night Hag army, to a god, even if he would die because of this. Gol Lek, my mistress. Hearing the former god and the current demigod, technically speaking, the Altoros demons were also demigods, address her in such a way, Shanka's vanity was greatly satisfied. It was not a waste to add the unequal address clause in the contract for nothing. Clean up this cave, the Night Hag immediately ordered. She did not care about Gol, Lek's noble identity, and directly ordered him as her butler. In the future, this will be our base. Just like the Plague Demon King built the Tower of Pain, I will also build a Hag court here that can dominate the Grey Wilderness. Gol Lek nodded. Although he was a little disdainful of the old Hag's boastful words, based on the previous contract, the new Altoros demon obediently went to clean the cave. Since Shanka did not specify the way to clean the cave, he might as well be lazy. He stretched out his arm with the head of a hyena, gnawed off all the stains on the ground and walls, and then swallowed them all into his stomach that could never be satisfied. Humph, what a useless guy! Looking at Gol Lek's behavior, Shanka could not help but feel a little angry. However, in the end, she controlled her expression very well and just secretly took out a necklace from her mage robe. This necklace was made of ether silk thread, and an inconspicuous charcoal gray inscription plate was hanging on it. This was Shanka's most important treasure, and it was called the Necklace of Concealment. Perhaps out of professional sensitivity, the experienced old hag would hoard some real stuff for life-saving purposes after years of making and selling fake goods. After all, if they walked too much at night, they might really run into a ghost one day. As for the magic items that they made themselves, they actually did not dare to use them themselves. But the Necklace of Concealment was different. It was a life-saving item that came from the Syrian royal family in the realm of Ether. The reason why such a treasure came out of the realm of Ether was that after the war with the Scale of Perpetual Order, the Syrians had been greatly weakened and had to sell some of the royal collection to subsidize the funds needed to rebuild their homeland. After obtaining this treasure, Shanka had specially slipped away to the Sigil City, where it was easy to get away from, to find an expert to appraise it. The few experts in the production of magical items were 100% sure that the raw material of the gray nameplate was some scale scraps scattered from the body of the famous time dragon. Even if it was fragments and not a complete scale, it was still priceless. Of course, a magical item made of such precious materials would have extraordinary functions. The necklace of concealment, as the name suggested, had the function of concealment. The wearer could hide their own health in the necklace at the cost of a period of cold and low fever. When the wearer was injured or extremely weak, the wearer could take out this hidden health to quickly heal their injuries. Because it involved the rules of time, this kind of rapid healing would not be offset by some curses or exemptions. No matter how serious the injury was, as long as enough health was hidden before, the necklace of concealment would definitely be able to heal. After the secret ceremony, although Go Lalic would not pose a threat to her according to the contract, out of caution, Shanka still kept such a backup to recover her health. She carefully put the necklace of concealment on her neck and chanted the spell to activate the black inscription plate. The following words are not counted in the word count. Recently, there have been a lot of friends who have rewarded me. Here, I would like to salute the likes of Shoutang 246, Ordivision Radiation, Love Dragon, Silencing Spirit Toad, Book Friend 202101241109452228, Jason Jing, and others who like to read the scale of perpetual order and love fantasy literature. Thank you for your support for the general industry. I will continue to work hard. Chapter 866. That's it. Pharaoh Mako was speechless as he looked at the trump card, being held hostage by the Syrian commandos, who was a strange night hag dressed in fancy clothes. Even if you find 100 night hags and tie them together, they won't be enough to deal with the scales of eternal order. He could not help but think to himself. From the pharaoh's point of view, this group of sirens was indeed afraid of Quith. They were afraid that if they were not careful, they would accidentally give the enemy an excuse to cause another war of ether. However, since they knew they were afraid, why did they still want to provoke the enemy? Perhaps out of the innate sensitivity of a diplomat, the Syrian diplomat sensed the doubts of the king of the Medici Empire. She stepped forward and tore off the rune cloth pasted on Shanka's mouth, allowing the leader of the Night Hag army to regain the right to speak and recite spells. Your Majesty Mako, she is not an ordinary Night Hag. As she spoke, the Syrian diplomat's throat moved, and Mako saw a whistle suddenly hanging from her lips. When the Syrian blew the whistle, the Night Ghost Woman's chest started to throb violently along with the sound of her whistle. An 8-clawed spider-like thing emerged from under her skin, but its legs were still firmly embedded in the Night Hag's flesh. Stop, stop! Shanka screamed and begged for mercy. She is controlled by the strange machinery of the engineering goblins. If she dares to move, her heart will be torn apart. Seeing that Pharaoh and Mako showed an interested look, the Syrian diplomat continued to boast. It can be said that this Night Hag is already obedient to us, and some of the demons who are loyal to her can also be used by us. Demons? Mako caught the key point. Altoros demon. The Syrian diplomat nodded, then turned to Shanka and ordered, "Summon your champion fighter, and let His Majesty see the strength of the strongest Yugoloth demon." After being tormented for a while, Shanka, who was already sweating profusely from the pain, could only obey. The leader of the Night Ghost Granny battle group uttered a simple phrase. Then, a tall figure suddenly appeared in the audience hall. Hiss! Mako couldn't help but gasp. As the heir to the vested interests of the Inverse Dimension movement, the most powerful mage in the Medici Empire's Obsidian Council, and the second pharaoh who combined the power of the Hero King and the Grand Vader, Mako was not an ignorant bumpkin. He could see the power of the evil demon in front of him at a glance. The power of evil was hidden in its ugly skin, ready to burst out at any time. "I'm not as good as him," Pharaoh admitted in his heart. However, what he was more curious about was how the Night Hag, who didn't seem to be anything special, was able to control such a terrifying demon? Could it be that he indulged in beauty or some other offerings? Although he had considerable strength, as a mortal, Marco still lacked experience and knowledge to match his strength. Therefore, after solving one of his doubts, he had even more doubts in his heart. Even under the light of the eternal blaze, the Syrian diplomat could not see Marco's micro-expressions, but she could more or less guess some of the thoughts of the king of the Medici Empire. However, she had already solved one puzzle for him. As for the rest, she had no obligation, or to be more precise, there was no need for her to explain it one by one. In fact, in order to fight against the scale of perpetual order, the Syrians had done more than what they had shown. Even though the Syrian diplomat was now discussing with Pharaoh and Marco how to stab them in the back, in fact, they had some other tricks up their sleeves in the dark, in a more difficult place to be noticed. Spath City. This city in the Medici Empire, under the jurisdiction of the Nome Special Province, welcomed the most important festival of the year today, Victory Day. In order to commemorate the victory of the great Megalosaurus Pasha over the Wusan invaders, the people of Spath would hold a grand celebration every year on this day. It was even grander than Opat Day. As the elected governor, Santos naturally had to share the joy with the people on this special day. He began to visit every street pavilion in the city early in the morning to express his condolences to the elderly and to donate various materials to the city's nursing home. This was a family tradition that had been passed down from his father's generation. Santos' family had persisted in this tradition for nearly half a century. Decades ago, Santos' father, Old Santos, had a great change in his life, because he had coincidentally joined the war chariot of the Megalosaurus Keys. The originally medium-sized sand rhino caravan had a chance to expand rapidly in order to meet the transportation needs of the last Palesan logistics company of the scale of perpetual order. After his father's death, Santos inherited his father's name and family business, and firmly clung to the thick thigh of the scale of perpetual order. Although Santos no longer had the right to manage the Sand Rhino caravan, due to the monopoly of the Chamber of Commerce, he still had a lot of dividends every year. As compensation, the scale of perpetual order also outsourced the domestication of various beasts to Santos' family. Not only the Sand Rhino, but also many new breeds bred in the breeding center, as long as they were suitable for breeding in the Ash world, were all outsourced to Santos' family by the Chamber of Commerce. This was also the reason why Santos' family was rooted in Spat. The majestic Nero River passed through the city and brought a lot of sand every year, enriching the land. Spat was a traditional food-producing city of the Medici Empire. Almost one-third of the whole empire's food and livestock trade was concentrated in this city. Santos' family's beasts domestication base was built here, so they could obtain the food needed to breed the beasts at a lower cost. After nearly 20 years of being rooted here, Santos' family had become one of the most prominent families in the city. Every 3 years, the elected governor would only be chosen between the Santos family and another family named Glow. Outsiders might think that there would be a rift between the two families because of this, but this was only the news that outsiders could get. The families of Glow and Santos had been connected since the previous generation. They had both pledged allegiance to the Megalosaurus Keys. The Santos family served the Megalosaurus in the commercial field, while Glow was the glove that Keys had arranged in Spat to secretly clean up the pharaoh's control over this big food-producing city. After the Igu family, which was related to the pharaoh, was exiled from Spat, Glow, who led the street forces of Spat, no longer had to hide in the dark. With his own power, Glow's family quickly intervened in the management of Spat and continued to guard the great Megalosaurus Keys' wealth, which had become insignificant. However, Chapter 867. Old Glow's death was too strange. Although the underworld magnate known as Glove might actually be much older than Old Santos, His body had always been very strong thanks to his years of exercise and temperance habits. But last month, Old Glow had died in his own home. According to the test results given by the family doctor, Old Glow had died suddenly in the middle of the night due to a sudden increase in blood pressure due to drinking too much honey wine. The next day after this tragedy, young Glow announced that he had inherited his father's name and wealth, and then became the patriarch of the Glow family. He also held a grand cremation ceremony for his father. This is too much of a coincidence. Santos had been pondering this question. Even though the scale of perpetual order had not conducted any official investigation into the sudden change of the Glow family, he could not let his guard down. Especially now, there was less than a week left before the triennial election of the elected governor. Everyone in Spat knew very well that after a series of formalities, the votes would eventually belong to the Glow family. After all, the Santos and Glow families had been ruling together for more than a decade, and this model was in the interest of most of the citizens of Spat. On the night of the victory celebration, after visiting the last nursing home in the city, Santos dismissed the guards sent by his family to help him transport the donations and provide protection. He wanted to go alone. Unlike his father, who had become a little fat due to neglect of self-management, old Santos was also a powerful warrior when he was young, otherwise he would not have been able to establish the Sand Rhino caravan to make a living. Santos, who was in the prime of his life, had been learning martial arts from many famous masters in the scale of perpetual order since he was a child, and his body had always been very strong. Moreover, when he was born, he had received the Dragon Disciple Enlightenment from Keys in recognition of old Santos' contribution. In addition, he was wearing a high-level Mad Armor vest under his clothes, which could be activated at any time to become a Mad Armor. Therefore, not to mention Spat, perhaps not many people in the entire Ashen world could pose a threat to his life. He put his hand into his pocket and took out a papyrus with a fine grid on it. He felt in the other pocket for a charcoal pencil. Bringing these things with him was a habit he had developed since childhood. Old Santos once taught him that a good memory is better than a lousy pen. A successful businessman must observe the market at any time and place and record the information in time for his own calm analysis. Under the protection of the scale of perpetual order, the Santos family did not have to worry about business competition, but he was still used to carrying a charcoal pencil and checkered paper with him. Thinking as he wrote was actually a very convenient way to organize his thoughts. Sometimes, as he wrote, the things that he couldn't figure out would all become clear. The night was too dark for painting, and he walked without a solid pad in his hand. However, this did not hinder Santos, who was used to writing blindly. He did not even look at the checkered papyrus. He directly wrote on it with a charcoal pencil what he had analyzed in the past few days about the strangeness of Old Glow's death. The biggest beneficiary of Old Glow's death is young Glow. Even his son cannot be cleared of suspicion. In the past 3 months, young Glow's business scale did not expand, but he unusually recruited a large number of foreign laborers. The Glow family bought a few farms in the suburbs of Spat, and the quantity of meat purchased there is somewhat abnormal. It is said that Glow has invested in the Colosseum that is being built, and it is claimed to be imitating the model of Taka City. As he wrote, all kinds of doubts gathered together, but Santos' thoughts gradually became clearer. He was more and more certain that there was something wrong with Glow. Perhaps I have to report these days' findings to the Chamber of Commerce. However, as an elected governor who is about to step down, if I secretly investigate my successor, will people accuse me of being greedy for power? Just as he was worrying about his gains and losses, Santos had unknowingly turned into an alley. There was only one more intersection, and he would be able to see the big house that his family had bought in the city. The alley was a little dark, and the dim moonlight seemed to be blocked by the surrounding buildings. Only a few taverns that were still open nearby spilled some light into the narrow alley. Suddenly, Santos heard the soft sound of boots scraping the ground, and the rustling of robes rubbing against each other. A pair of strong hands grabbed him by the back of the neck and directly dragged him into a wall beside the alley. Santos, who was caught, not only felt sore and powerless, but because the back of his neck was grabbed, it was also difficult for him to concentrate on summoning spells to defend himself. However, the pain that he imagined did not come. Santos was stiff and focused on listening. He could only hear his own violent heartbeat, and there was no other noise. "Don't make a mistake." He mustered up his courage and shouted a warning. However, after all, he was used to living like a prince, and he still did not have the courage to turn around and fight to the death. "Little fatty, you're still so timid." Santos was shocked when he heard this, but his uneasiness was immediately relieved. This was because, other than his father, the only people who knew and would call him Little Fatty were the elders of the Scale of Perpetual Order who had teased him when he was young. He turned around abruptly and saw a giant that looked like a black iron tower, literally, standing behind him. "Lord Neru," Santos hurriedly greeted. When his eyes adjusted to the darkness in the courtyard, he realized that other than the ogre Neru who had used the shrinking spell, there were also 15 or 16 desert elven supreme warriors in black clothes, black pants, and black veils standing neatly in the courtyard. The only exception in terms of attire was a bald pirate-like figure wearing a short brown jacket that sailors often wore. His face was tattooed with a strange totem, and he was leaning on a long battle-axe as he stood in a slanted manner. However, Santos did not ask any questions. Since the ogre Neru was here, the Scale of Perpetual Order must have paid enough attention to Spat City. The only thing that the Chamber of Commerce paid attention to in this city was undoubtedly the sudden death of Old Glow in his home, and the change of power in the Glow family. At first, Santos thought that after greeting him, the one who would ask him questions would be the leader of the team, Neru. This ogre was not only a powerful warrior famous in the multiverse, but also one of the founding elders of the Scale of Perpetual Order. However, he did not expect that the one who would ask him questions would be the warrior dressed like a pirate. "Consul, my name is Neru." Santos put the long battle-axe on his shoulder, and only then did he realize that the handle of the battle-axe was equipped with a trigger and a magazine. Neru walked up to Santos and said, "I guess you must have a lot of questions in your mind, but I can't answer you now. Instead, I want to see what you are confused about." As he spoke, Neru raised his chin and motioned for Santos to take out the papyrus that he had hidden in his sleeve. Chapter 868. When Santos returned home, his butler, who had been waiting for a long time, immediately came over and handed him a gilded invitation card. This was something that Master Glow had just sent over. Although there were only a few lines of text in the invitation, they were all written in ink that had been mixed with gemstone powder. They shone brightly under the light. "Honorable Master Santos, I sincerely invite you to come to the Majestic Manor tomorrow. Don't forget to meet me." He stamped his personal seal on the blank space on the sign-in column. The words written with gemstone powder suddenly came to life, twisting and transforming as they meandered across the snow-white paper. Finally, they turned into a precise map. The map pointed out the location of the Majestic Manor, and at the same time, the best route from Spat to the manor was marked out. "You've really put in a lot of effort. I'm afraid this invitation card would take at least a dozen gold drogs," Santos muttered to himself. The gold drogs were the gold currency issued by the Scale of Perpetual Order. They were also the currency with the largest denomination among the current common currencies of the Chamber of Commerce. The value of one gold drog was equivalent to 73 silver carats of the Medici Empire. The reason why this invitation card was so expensive was that it was not only made of high-grade materials, but also had 2 alchemy skills attached to it. The words changed after Santos stamped his personal seal was one of them. When the words changed into a map, the magnetic ink on the receipt in Master Glow's hand also showed the words, except at the same time. This was another alchemy skill. After the end of the Victory Day, Santos, the elected governor, had a much easier time dealing with his daily affairs. Since he had received the invitation card and had nothing else to do, early the next morning, Santos and a few of his servants rode on the Sand Rhino and followed the route marked on the map to the Majestic Manor for the appointment. Originally, as an elected governor, he could have directly dispatched the small Leviathan speedboat docked at the airport of Spat if he was on official business. However, since this trip was not official, and Santos had not ridden on his domesticated Sand Rhino for a long time, he decided to use this slightly backward method at the last minute. Sitting in the palanquin on the back of the Sand Rhino, Santos leaned against the soft velvet fabric. While feeling the cool breeze blowing in through the gauze curtain, he leisurely picked up a cherry from the fruit plate beside him and threw it into his mouth. After decades of governance, the outer environment of Spat City was obviously much better than before. Even after walking out of the fertile land, the desert was not as hot as before. Rows of hay lattices covered the sand dunes, and a totem pole stood at the top of each sand dune to fix the sand. The people of Spat was using hard work and advanced technology to transform the desert bit by bit. In fact, the majestic manor that the Glows had recently purchased was the most direct manifestation of the results of the transformation of Spat. In the past, there were no suburban farms in Spat. The desert was just a few parasangs away from the city center. But now, there were dozens of manors like the Majestic Manor that were more than a dozen parasangs away from the city center. When Santos finished the entire silver plate of cherries and drank a pot of guava wine filtered with moonstone powder, the Sand Rhino that had been striding forward without stopping finally came to a stop. It sounded like the bell inside the palanquin. It was the servant sitting on the Sand Rhino's shoulder reminding Santos. "That's fast." The roads outside Sparut were much better than they were a few decades ago, so the Sand Rhinoceros had arrived earlier than Santos had expected. He stood up from the velvet cushion and stepped on a footboard beside the palanquin. A flying carpet flew over from nowhere and hovered outside the gauze curtain of the palanquin. Santos stepped on the carpet and slowly landed on the ground. His servants had long since slipped down from the shoulders of the Sand Rhinoceros with soft ropes. They swiftly gathered behind their employer and prepared the ceremonial guard of honor for him as an elected consul. Before the Sand Rhino arrived, the guards standing on the watchtower of the Majestic Manor had already seen the beast, so Glows was already prepared to welcome it. Bam, 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 following the three drumbeats, the melodious horn and the clanging cymbals suddenly chimed together. The gate on the stone wall of the Majestic Manor was pushed open from the inside. The current patriarch of the Glows family immediately walked out with a large group of people in a line. Two servants carrying a bundle of brocade carpet scrolls trotted all the way. When Santos was about 30 yards away from the Majestic Manor, they finally paved the expensive VIP passage for the elected consul. Brother Glows, Brother Santos, the family heads of the two prominent families in Spat City, as well as the elected officials, greeted each other warmly with an elbow salute when they met. They didn't use overly formal honorifics and instead called each other brothers. However, this display of affection was only for outsiders to see. Every Santos and Glow knew that the Scales of Eternity Chamber of Commerce had set up a management system in Spat City that was similar to the two princes in power. The purpose was to keep the two families in check. Perhaps there was a tacit understanding in the distribution of benefits, but in terms of power and friendship, if the two families wanted to enjoy the glory of Sparut for a long time, they had to be completely separate. Of course, it was still possible to be polite when meeting. After greeting each other, Glows warmly welcomed Santos into his Majestic Manor. But when he walked past the heavy stone gate and saw the decorative patterns on the inside, Santos' eyes couldn't help but narrow. Although he quickly covered it up by wiping his eyes, the beast-like giant claw pattern did remind him of something. Walking in the majestic manner, Santos smelled a quiet scent of incense. Glows explained to him enthusiastically, "In order to welcome you, Brother Santos, as the elected consul, I had people tidy up the manor inside and out several times. Early this morning, I had people carry a few large barrels of smoldering agarwood to smoke this place again." "That's very thoughtful of you." Santos walked beside Glows and patted his arm. Now, the two of them seemed to be the opposite of their fathers. Santos didn't have the big belly of the old Santos, and was tall and strong, while Glows didn't inherit the tall and thin figure of the old Glows. Instead, he was a little short and thin. They walked along the winding road for a long time before entering the meeting hall that was temporarily used as a meeting room. The seats inside had been arranged according to Medica's traditional banquet style, waiting for the two patriarchs to take their seat. However, what puzzled Santos was that there was someone waiting for them here. "This is Mr. Vaprak." He pointed at the man with his palm facing up as a sign of respect. "I invited you to the party today to introduce you to each other. Let's take a seat," Grok said as he pointed at the man with his palm facing up as a sign of respect. Chapter 869. Mr. Vaprak and I want to invest in SPAT and build a super coliseum that's even more spectacular than the Grand Coliseum. We want to recruit all the heroes in the world to compete with each other. During the banquet, Glow kept trying to persuade Santos. Although Santos had been smiling and expressing his support, he had not actually made any guarantees. He had been observing the VIP guest Glow had invited, named Vaprak. Vaprak had mottled brownish-green skin and a terrifyingly muscular body. He wore a sleeveless waistcoat made of an unknown material. Even though he was sitting on a low table, he was still taller than a person. His head was bald, but there was a long braid at the back of his head that looked like a rat's tail. During the banquet, this Vaprak did not say a word. He only took the roast boar, beef ribs, and braised poultry meat that the chef brought to him. He ate heartily as if he had never had a full meal before. However, no matter how much he ate, his stomach did not bulge. It was as if there was still room for it. Glow noticed that Santos had been observing Vaprak's table manners, which made him feel a little embarrassed. However, because he knew Vaprak's background, he did not dare to say anything to this god. After all, Vaprak did not feel anything when someone else watched him eat. As the saying goes, as long as you don't feel awkward, others will feel awkward. In the end, it was Santos who broke the awkward atmosphere. Perhaps he was too lazy to keep up the pretense. Therefore, when Vaprak began to complain about why the chef was serving the dishes slower, he directly asked Glow's esteemed guest, "You have quite a good appetite. I really didn't know that the food in Rock Crusher was this bad." Suddenly, Vaprak looked up and glanced at Santos. The burly man broke the beef leg bone in his hand into two pieces and casually threw them on the table in front of him. "What's so good about that place?" He stood up and cracked his neck. "Well, I heard that the third floor of Asgrat is not bad. It's just that it's a little far from my base." "You are so direct." Grabbing Glow, who was about to give him a toast, Santos also stood up from his seat. Unknowingly, a long-bladed battle-axe had appeared in his hand. The sawtooth blade was stuck next to Glow's neck, close to his skin. "I climbed 524 floors and then came to the material plane through the portal on the plane of 10,000 abyss." Naaman, who had changed back to his original appearance, reached out his palm and stroked his curved horns that were protruding backward. Scrolls made of contracts instantly wrapped him from head to toe as if he had turned himself into a mummy. Although my spies detected a visit or two in the plane of 10,000 abyss, I really did not expect that it was an incarnation of a god and a demon lord. The reason why he had turned into a contract to the monster in front of his eyes was that he could not defeat him. After being transformed into a leviathan, his genetic information had been retained in the archive of the young Megalosaurus keys. Even if he died, he could be resurrected in the form of a clone. But how could a cunning creature like a contract reject an extra chance of survival? In addition, while transforming, Numan also sent a message to some of his men. The Desert Elf Supreme Warriors, who had disguised themselves as Santos's servants with phantom masks, were also rushing to the audience hall. They had just been busy secretly cleaning up the guards of the Glow family in the majestic manor, and now the entire manor had been cleaned up. Well, do you think they can get in? Vaprak's ears twitched. He heard the movements of the Desert Elf Supreme Warriors. The exceptionally well-built fellow stretched out his hand, and the ground rose up with squeaking sounds as a thick wooden club jumped into his palm. He waved his hand and the club made a bang sound. Then the Desert Elf Supreme Warriors, who were about to rush into the door, were all knocked out by the hurricane caused by the swing of the weapon. They were like leaves in the wind. The two desert elves who rushed at the front died before they could hit the ground. Even after falling to the ground, the corpses were still spitting out broken internal organs in large mouthfuls. Even though they were wearing light Mad Knight armor, their chests were still crushed by the wind pressure. They were only a few inches away from their back. The desert elves were all trained warriors. Those who survived still obeyed Numan's orders and continued to rush to the audience hall, wanting to participate in the encirclement of Vaprak. But no matter how they slashed with their machetes or shot with their electromagnetic nail submachine guns, they still could not break through the invisible force field wall at the door. And it may not be safe outside. Vaprak snorted. As if he had received a secret signal, the ground suddenly began to rumble and tremble. The door to the cellar of the majestic manor was sent flying into the sky. Ogres with coarse skin, small, unfriendly eyes, and large mouths full of sharp teeth rushed out from the cellar. There were also some hill giants who were similar in appearance but were even taller and stronger. They raised huge stone hammers and followed in the ranks of the ogres. It was only then that Numan understood why Glow had spent so much money to get someone to smoke the entire majestic manor with smoldering agarwood. Even if the ogres and hill giants were hiding in the cellar, the stench they emitted could be smelled from afar as long as it leaked out from the crack. The group of Desert Elven Supreme Warriors waiting outside the audience hall were besieged by nearly 100 ogres, mixed with a dozen hill giants. No matter how skilled they were in martial arts or how well equipped they were, they gradually fell into a situation where they could not hold on any longer. If they were not careful, they would lose some of their members. When the savage monsters saw the wounded desert elves on the ground, they would often rush forward and devour them in the blink of an eye. Eating raw meat and drinking blood, they did not care about raw or cold food. It was truly terrifying. And this was exactly what the gods wanted. As the god of ogres, Vaprak had a barbaric quality that matched the ogres. Some ogres respected him as their guardian. According to the research of a scholar whose name must not be revealed, Vaprak might be a terrible descendant of the giant god Anan. He should only be half ogre and not a pure-blooded ogre. To his priests and shamans, Vaprak's actions and revelations were often unreasonable acts of compulsion. He was even a little crazy. Out of his own anxiety and as a crazy defense against fear, mainly because he was worried that the powerful giant gods would take away the ogre's faith. He constantly urged his followers to fight, invade, and fall into madness. Just like now, watching his followers burn their energy in unreasonable acts of violence made Vaprak feel a sense of peace and tranquility that he had not felt in a long time. However, this atmosphere was quickly broken. Chapter 870. Ha ha ha! A massive creature suddenly descended from the sky, accompanied by a maniacal laughter that sounded like thunder. It landed in the midst of the ogres and mountain giant. A large crater appeared on the ground, and the ground shook slightly as if there was an earthquake. The legendary ogre warlord Nera had arrived. Roar! Unlike his sloppy and stinky brethren, this god of war was clad in a sturdy adamantine plate armor covered in spikes. The ebony chain in his hand was even longer than the height of 2 hill giants combined. With just a casual wave of his hand, Neru had cleared out dozens of yards around him. The ogres and hill giants were no match for this legendary ogre, who was so tall and strong that it was ridiculous. Ordinary ogres were about 12 feet tall, and although hill giants were taller, there was a limit. Neru had not even removed the shrinking spell on his body, but he was already more than 20 feet tall. As for the true size of this legendary ogre, he had already surpassed the storm giants and rune giant. He was infinitely close to the titans that most giants only knew of in myths and epic. In the tribe of giants and ogres, size was not only a symbol of talent, but also a yardstick to measure right and wrong. Neru's huge size was simply absolute power and, naturally, absolute justice. Therefore, even if some priests and shamans of Vaprak incited them, the ogres and hill giants did not dare to attack Neru, who was a monster of super justice, for fear of being killed on the spot. If you want to fight, fight. If you want to retreat, retreat. If you want to fight, why not fight? Whether you can fight or not is not an excuse. Whether you want to fight or not is the biggest difference. Only with such awareness can a coward regain his lost courage. Neru roared loudly. In fact, Keys had asked him to memorize this in advance before returning to the Ash world. He said that shouting it during a battle would have an unexpected effect. But at that time, Neru had been puzzled. Why did he have to shout to educate his opponents? However, now that he saw his own kind who were hesitant to move forward, he somewhat understood Quest's painstaking efforts. These guys were really a little useless. They were of the same race as him, but not only were they not as tall as him, even their courage and bravery were not on the same level as him. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. The adamantine plate armor on Neru's body shone with the light of runes. This was a spell that the half-lich Snade had specially added to him. It could absorb the anger in his emotions to change the shape of the armor. During a battle, as Neru's rage increased, the armor would not only become more ferocious, but it would also enlarge to fit his body. Neru, who had wanted to fight to his heart's content, changed back to his original appearance, an ogre nearly 70 feet tall. In an instant, he appeared in the middle of the yard of the majestic manor. The tallest hill giant around him barely reached his calf. Thick fangs protruded from his lower jaw, and his scarlet eyes were like 2 pools of blood. No one knew who took the lead, but some ogres and hill giants among the fearful monsters dropped the weapons in their hands and knelt on the ground to worship Neru. Preposterous! Vaprak, the ogre god, saw the scene. Even though he knew that his followers were not devout, the fact that they were kneeling before another being while he was still present was a provocation to the god. He roared loudly and charged out of the audience hall, not even bothering with the mana contract gate that was close at hand. The surging anger of the god turned into physical destruction. After Vaprak rushed out, the audience hall shattered into pieces as if it had been hit by a meteorite. Under the influence of the god's anger, Neru could not use the teleportation spell to leave. He could only try his best to create a protective force field around him. If that was not possible, he could only use the contract demon's body to take the hit. Vaprak did not care about the puny contract demon at all. The angry god was now focused on how to deal with the provocation of his unworthy descendant, Neru. His incarnation had also returned to its original appearance. It was a huge ogre with mottled brown-green skin and animal skin. Unfortunately, although his incarnation was huge, it was still a head shorter than Neru. Even if he had mutated, thick and sharp claws, it could not cover the disadvantage brought by the difference in height. In the simple concept of giants and ogres, a strong body meant everything. Even if the ogre god did not want to admit it, he did think that Neru's unbelievably tall and strong body was actually more suitable for him to show his majesty and dignity. In fact, the reason why he came to the world of ashes was because he had considered this before. With the rapid development of the scale of perpetual order, the name of the three ogre brothers had spread throughout the multiverse. As the god of the ogres, Vaprak did have the idea of including them in his own belief system. Neru, who was the strongest among the ogres, was the god who favored him the most and even had the idea of promoting him to become the second ogre god. However, this idea was mercilessly shattered by reality today. Although Vaprak was jealous and narrow-minded, sometimes he did have extraordinary observation skills. Just by relying on his outstanding appearance, the legendary ogre could make his believers kneel down and worship him. If he really became a god, it would be terrible. After all, the multiverse was a world of appearance. The ogres could not provide much faith in the first place, otherwise, Vaprak, who was almost as old as some of the second-generation giant gods, would not be a weak god. If Neru's name spread for a few more years, this talented ogre might even be able to ascend to godhood on his own. At the same time, he would also take away a large portion of Vaprak's faith. Kneel. Mortal, I'll give you one last chance. After thinking about it, Vaprak felt that he could still try to trick Neru. If the other party was afraid of the majesty of the gods, then he could subtly change it and even turn it into an incarnation that was suitable for him to descend as a god. However, he had never thought about how much fear Nalu had of the gods after he had experienced and won many battles with the gods or demigod powers. Die! Neru roared, interrupting Vaprak's words. The ogres and mountain giants kneeling on the ground felt their ears buzzing. They did not expect that one of their kind would dare to curse a god. Chapter 871. Neru swung the ebony chain and hit Vaprak like he was hitting a golf ball. Although the attack did not cause much damage, it was extremely humiliating. The ogre god, who was known for his strong body, had not been slapped in the face like this for many years. The last time he was in such a sorry state was because he had an improper relationship with a certain goddess in the giant god system. Because of that, he was slapped by the young and vigorous second-generation main god of the giant god system, Sycamaz, the giant's god of the sun, sky, weather, and ocean, into the bottomless abyss. However, Sycamaz was the eldest son of the giant god of creation, Anan. To be thrown into the abyss by such a noble and powerful being, Vaprak's defeat was an honorable one. But now, he was slapped in the face by an ordinary being, and this ordinary being was technically one of his people. If news of this got out, he would definitely become the latest joke of the gods. You are asking for your own death. Vaprak's body was sturdy. Although he was tall, his avatar still had the typical fat belly and stubby legs of an ogre. After being hit by Neru, he quickly stabilized himself and did not fall to the ground. However, the wound on his face caused by the ebony chain could not be healed no matter what healing spells he cast. Neru snorted coldly when he heard Vaprak's attempt to intimidate him. He was not affected by the fear spell in Vaprak's voice at all. The last two guys who said the same thing. Howrin threw the ebony spikes out and killed a few ogres and hill giants who could not dodge in time. This made the remaining monsters even more fearful. The grass on the grave is now 30 feet tall. Don't you think it's a coincidence that one of them is a god, and the other is a demon lord? When it came to taunting his enemies, Neru, who grew up with Bru, who always had ideas, was much more skilled than Vaprak, who hid at the bottom of the abyss all day long. Moreover, after using irony to infuriate Vaprak, the legendary ogre warlord calmly launched his next round of attack. He wanted to use his fists to teach his opponent a lesson. In his opinion, Vaprak, who had a giant beast claw as his emblem, was the perfect candidate to test his newly invented nuclear-powered glove. When Naruto had just received Numon's message asking for help and knew that the ogre god had infiltrated the Ash world, he had been looking forward to this battle. He wanted to see if his opponent's claws were sharper or if his fists were harder. The nuclear-powered gloves were not a fixed component. Instead, they were like flowing mercury. When Na Lu punched out, they quickly spread and covered the ogre's hands. Facing Vaprak's crossed arms as a defensive block, Na Lu continued to press forward with an unstoppable momentum, producing a dull bang. Even though the ogre god's avatar didn't move, his coarse feet still plowed 2 deep trenches on the ground. The trenches extended all the way to the audience hall behind him before stopping. However, this was only the beginning. Apart from Nera's immense strength, the nuclear-powered gauntlet was not an inanimate object. Iron rock collapse. Back off. With Na Lu's angry roar, the originally streamlined surface of the gauntlet suddenly formed wave-like ripples. The built-in nuclear power device continuously transmitted another irresistible force to the place where the glove touched Vaprak's crossed arms. Bang! 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 It was like a piledriver. Vaprak, who had thought that Na Lu's punches were exhausted and wanted to counterattack, was caught off guard and couldn't stand firm. He stumbled backward and staggered out of Glow's manor and farmlands. It was not until his feet stepped into the desert that Vaprak finally stopped with the help of the friction between his feet and the sand. At this time, the ogre god's mutated arms, which looked like mottled crab claws, were not only bruised and swollen, but there were also large areas of cracks on his skin. The god's divine blood flowed out of the wounds and dyed the yellow sand on the ground red. The foul blood polluted a large area of land. If it was not dealt with in the future, no crops would grow on this land. However, that was a matter for the future. Na Lu did not have the time to think so much. The legendary ogre warlord's mind was now filled with thoughts of how to destroy the god's avatar in front of him. Although mortals could not kill a true god, he also wanted to kill a god's avatar. Furthermore, the nuclear-powered gauntlet had only shown one of its functions. This is a good thing. As if to encourage himself, Na Lu roared again. The surging aura even tore apart the clouds in the sky. He stomped his feet, and yellow sand splashed up as the huge ogre rose into the air. Meteor fall. While Vaprak was still unsteady, Na Lu leaped high and clenched his fists. The nuclear-powered gauntlet merged into one, as if he was holding a huge hammer. However, just as Vaprak quickly dodged to avoid the heavy blow, the nuclear-powered gauntlet suddenly broke away from Na Lu's hands with a bang. Like a meteor, the hammer turned into a missile and hit the avatar of the ogre god once again. The sudden blow made him accidentally break his defense. Not only was his chin directly smashed by the nuclear-powered glove, but the 2 fangs protruding from his lower jaw were also all broken, causing his mouth to be full of blood. Today was like Vaprak's Good Friday. He was a god, but in a material plane like the Ash World, he was hammered on the head by a mortal like Na Lu. After experiencing face-slapping, being pushed away, and being disfigured, which were unacceptable to him, he immediately welcomed the 4th blow that made him feel even more humiliated. The nuclear-powered missile gauntlet that had just hit Vaprak's face was connected to a chain made of an unknown material. After hitting the target, Na Lu shook his hand, and the nuclear-powered gauntlet opened at once. Then, while Vaprak's reaction was slightly slow due to the dizziness, the 2 gauntlets closed together again. However, this time, they grabbed the neck of the ogre god and held him firmly in the palm of his hand. Heaven and earth return. Na Lu's muscles all over his body swelled up, and even some cracks appeared on the refined gold-enchanted armor on his body. He pulled the chain, and with the help of the nuclear-powered gauntlet's vector thruster, he suddenly pulled Vaprak's avatar, who was only a head shorter than him, up into the air. Then he pulled Vaprak's avatar and smashed him to the ground. Then he pulled Vaprak up again and smashed him down again. Chapter 872. In the vast astral world, a huge megalosaurus was preying on a group of astral whales. Just by detecting its wandering trajectory, the Githyanki's wandering in this star field would be scared out of their wits. They would quickly fly away in their spaceships, fearing that they would lose their lives if they were too slow. Noisy little things. With his powerful psionic ability, Keyes could detect a fairly vast area in the astral world. The thoughts of those Githyanki's could not escape his detection. You don't even have 3 tails of meat on your body. What are you worried about? After silently complaining, the young blue dragon turned his attention to the food he had just caught. An astral whale the size of an island in the material plane had been killed. Although this kind of meat did not decay quickly due to the particularity of the astral environment, some bacteria in its body began to multiply, and the gas produced would still affect the taste of the food. Therefore, in the spirit of not wasting food, Keyes first tore the astral whale into strips of meat with his sharp claws, and then roasted it into jerky with blazing plasma. Holding a handful of jerky, Keyes pulled out a strip from time to time, put it in his mouth, chewed, and swallowed. Although this kind of dry food did not have any flavor, it was more than enough to fill the stomach. The young blue dragon had been looking for something in the astral world for the past few years, and he had eaten a lot of astral whale jerky. However, even when he was eating, he did not stop moving. Instead, he continued to move quickly in one direction. As early as 5 years ago, the young blue dragon had quelled the chaos on Dwarf Island in the Ramsey Plain and digested the fragment of Stim's divine kingdom. He had the magical ability to change the creation of the universe, and his growth cycle had taken a big step forward again. Keyes had felt that some shackles in his body had been broken, and he was about to enter the adult Megalosaurus stage. However, he knew that he lacked an opportunity. A creature strong enough to kill a god had a perceptive ability that could not be guessed by ordinary creatures. Since Keyes sensed that something was missing, then that thing must exist. Over the past few years, he had been trying his best to find that thing and rarely asked about the matters of the scales of eternal order. Of course, that didn't mean that he didn't know how the Chamber of Commerce operated. In fact, every Leviathan in the scale of perpetual order could be regarded as his eyes. The young blue dragon used these eyes to observe the operations of the Chamber of Commerce. Only on rare occasions would he give his opinion or strength to the Chamber of Commerce. For example, when he had gone to the ether plane to help the Chamber of Commerce in the war, he had caused the Sur race to lose 1/10 of their numbers. Another example was when an unwelcome guest visited the Ash world from the 10,000 Abyss planes. Although he had already learned the identity of the guest from the mouth of the Tautai beast, who had obtained the will of the bottomless abyss, he still did not reveal it to the other members of the Chamber of Commerce due to some considerations. Instead, he chose to dispatch Neru to the Ash world to quell this storm, because he could feel that this was not only a precious opportunity for his friend to break through the ceiling of the Ogre Warlord's strength, but also the best way for him to participate in a major event of the multiverse. In fact, in addition to Neru, who had turned into a Leviathan, above the clouds in the sky of the Ash world, the airship Nephrimandis was also taking panoramic images of the ground. Heaven and earth return from the images. Keyes recognized the move that Neru had used to knock Vaprak unconscious. To be honest, this was the name that he, who was not good at naming things, had made up when he was chatting with the Ogre Warlord and thought of the powerful green-skinned monster. However, this name was appropriate. Anyway, Vaprak, who had been hit by this combo, did feel that the world was spinning. Not only was his face bruised and swollen, but his whole body also seemed to have fallen apart. Every time this incarnation of the ogre god came into close contact with the ground of the Ash world, he felt the thrill of a high-speed collision with a material plane. After more than 20 cycles of flying up and smashing down, not to mention the majestic manner of the Glow family being razed to the ground, even people in Spat, a dozen pale sands away, suspected that there had been an earthquake. Even the ogres and hill giants who were kept in this manner were all loyal fans of Vaprak, and some of them were priests and shamans of the ogre god. After seeing the strange scene of their god being defeated and Neru showing off his divine power, they could not help but be shaken. They all had a terrifying thought. Perhaps the ogre who was as strong as a giant was more suitable to be the main god of their race. Of course, the biggest problem they were facing now was that the aftermath of this battle was too violent. Even when they saw that something was wrong, they immediately began to flee in all directions. However, some ogres were still hit by the stones and soil that were shot out. Any monster that was hit by the stones would have a large piece of flesh cut off, as if they had been hit by hell's roar. Looking at their fellow ogres who were unfortunately injured, the ogres and hill giants, who were mostly selfish by nature, did not care about their lives at all. Instead, they sped up and fled from them as if they were worried that they would be affected by the halo of bad luck of those unlucky ogres. They wished that they had 2 more legs so that they could run faster. The ogres and hill giants who had fallen to the ground howled and begged for Vaprak's help. However, they did not receive any response. Vaprak had the title of Ogre God, but he had never really cared about the welfare of this race. As for the hill giants, they were just tools for him to compete with Gloranto for faith. They all began to curse the god that they had once worshipped. Their intelligence is worrying. Well, maybe not. Keys saw everything that was happening on the ground through the perspective of the Nafman disc. At first, he thought that the ogres and hill giants who were about to die would definitely be stupid to curse the gods before they ascended to the divine kingdom and became petitioners. But on second thought, considering the location of Vaprak's divine kingdom, he suddenly saw the light. Instead, he felt that these guys had some inexplicable wisdom. Since you don't want to go there so much, I'll give you a hand. Keys, who was in the astral plane, had a sly smile on his face. He then gave an order to the Nafman dis. Not long after, the ogres and hill giants that were heavily injured and waiting for death all fell into the pits that had suddenly been dug out from under them. They were immediately knocked unconscious by the Pharaoh's blade summoned by the Nafman dis. Then, they were immediately teleported to the headquarters of the Scale of Perpetual Order in the territory of the Dragonborn clan by the legendary level Primordial Dragon. There, these guys would be treated while they were unconscious, and today's memory would be deepened. Then, they would be sent to portals or spaceships to other worlds to share what they had seen with their brethren in those worlds. Keys wanted to use them to spread the shocking news of Vaprak being beaten up by the ogre Neru. At the same time, he wanted to explore the possibility of changing faith, or rather, snatching faith from the hands of a god. Chapter 873. There were 2 reasons why Vaprak's avatar could not defeat the legendary ogre warlord Neru. First, as a god with weak divine power and also a demon lord, his avatar was not as powerful as a real god. Second, Vaprak's spellcasting ability was extremely limited, and he had always relied on his unnaturally strong body to fight his enemies. Now that he met Neru, who was stronger and fiercer than him, he naturally did not have the advantage he had in the past. Therefore, regardless of whether he was careless or overconfident, after he lost the upper hand, he was quickly pressed to the ground by the battle-hardened Neru. Not long after, the avatar of the ogre god began to lose his consciousness and became delirious. Moreover, he vaguely felt as if he had been stabbed in the back, but he couldn't figure out what had gone wrong. Vaprak had come to the world of ashes to seek a clergy in the field of battle. Originally, he had the authority of ogre and greed, but because these 2 authorities could no longer support his ambition, he was driven by greed and wanted to obtain a clergy that was more beneficial to him. From a Yugoloth ferrying across the river Styx, the ogre god, who was hidden deep in the abyss, learned about the Scale of Perpetual Order, which had been in the limelight for the past few decades. Therefore, with the help of the flourishing development of the Scale of Perpetual Order, he expanded his faith base through the operation of the gladiator arena. Then, he naturally came into contact with the field of battle related to the Scale of Perpetual Order. His plan was not bad, and the beginning of the plan went very smoothly. After sneaking into the 10,000 Abyss Plane, Vaprak did not take long to find a portal that was said to be connected to the nest of the scale of perpetual order. After coming to the world of ashes, he spent a few months to gather information and gather some local ogres and mountain giants for his own use. As for why he had directed the sudden change of the Glow family? In fact, it was because he had very accidentally heard from some merchants that this family had a close relationship with the scale of perpetual order. Then, he had a devious idea. The ogre god first tempted little Glow and promised him his power. Then, he wanted to use this as a springboard to pull another prominent family in Spat, the Santos family, into his war chariot. That was why he had asked Glow to invite Santos to a banquet. But he didn't expect that before he could complete his plan, the claws of the Eternal Order's Scales Chamber of Commerce. No, it should be said that their fists had already arrived. Bang! 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 Although Vaprak was tall and had a violent personality, violent and cruel, in fact, the word brave had not appeared many times in his life. Seeing that his clone was about to be smashed apart, Vaprak forcibly pulled the divine power away from his body, thinking that it was better to lose less than it was to lose more. When Nalu finished using Heaven and Earth Reversal, and was about to use Cross Strangle, to twist off his head as a trophy, Vaprak's incarnation suddenly collapsed and turned into a pile of rotten soil that emitted a foul smell. Looking at the remains left behind by the god that looked like a small hill of rice fields, Nehru could not help but take a step back. He even began to despise the nuclear-powered gloves in his hands because they had just come into close contact with that pile of filth. However, after calling the base of the scale of perpetual order and asking them to send people to clean up the battlefield, Nehru did not leave immediately. He saw that some ogres and mountain giants who were originally loyal to Vaprak were now kneeling and kowtowing to him. What's going on? Nehru felt that after this battle, he seemed to have awakened something, but he was not sure if it was an illusion. Looking at the kneeling ogres, the ogre could not help but scratch the sharp horn on his head. There were many things that he could not figure out. He felt that he had to ask Keys, Brew, or Nehru for advice. Shanka reluctantly took out a strange item from her treasure pouch and put it on the ground. It was as long as it was vertical and had a strange symmetrical shape. It had 3 hands, 3 legs, 3 eyes, and a big mouth on top of its head. This is a special-shaped boat made from Elder Saul's stone monster. The leader of the demonic granny army introduced the boat to the few Syrians beside her. We rode on it and swam from the soil to the domestication base without anyone noticing. Because the Elder Saul's stone monsters once served the earth elemental goddess Galanba when she was still a Aragami, these monsters are protected by the earth and cannot be detected by ordinary means. This way, they can sneak into anyone's treasure vault and steal precious metals and rare gems to satisfy their insatiable appetite. Just tell us how to use this thing. The siren diplomat impatiently interrupted Shanka's rambling. In her opinion, this was the occupational disease of the ghouls after years of selling fake goods. Okay, since you are in such a hurry. Shanka smiled awkwardly and corrected herself. She walked to the side of the boat and took out a scroll from the scroll pouch of the Elder Saul's stone monster. She pressed her finger on a circular rune drawn on the scroll and spun it a few times as if she was using a dial phone. The runes on the scroll then pieced together into a spell to activate the boat. Soon after, the large mouth on top of Saul's stone monster's adversity crossing boat opened, and the spiral-shaped sharp teeth all stuck into its flesh, leaving a safe passage for the passengers. Shanka took the lead and led a few sirens, including the diplomat, into the spacious abdomen of the Elder Saul's stone monster. Although the boat had expanded to a diameter of more than 10 feet after it was taken out of the pouch, the sirens found that there was something else inside. The size of the abdomen of the boat was comparable to the meeting hall where they met Pharaoh and Mako. In the center of the boat's abdomen was a pink brain in a glass container suspended in a fluorescent green solution. Beside it stood a heavenly hound in a white robe. Its eyes were lifeless, and it didn't seem to be alive. Seeing that all the sirens had come in, Shanka quickly went to the brain. She first pressed a red button under the glass container, then picked up the 2 wires connected to the glass container and pressed the magnetic ends of the wires on the metal inlays on the temples of the Tengu's head. "This is one of my elders." Shanka patted the glass container containing the pink brain. Because she sold a dragon-slaying weapon in front of a red dragon noblewoman in human form, she was split in 2 by that evil customer. I tried to save her, but in the end I could not save her. I could only take her brain out and recycle it. She will be driving us for the rest of the journey. Chapter 874. None of the Syrians, including the diplomat, believed a single word that Shanka said. They knew all too well what kind of evil creatures the Anababas were. Therefore, even though the leader of the Night Hag army spoke the truth, the Anababas were still wary of her as if she was a thief. "It's time for us to depart." Tengu, who was connected to the brain in the vat, suddenly spoke. Her voice was as noisy as an owl's. No one knew if it was because of her original voice or because she was using Tengu's mouth to transmit her voice. "Yes, yes, yes," Shanka replied casually. Then, the ship, which had the appearance of Elder Saul's stone monster, began to tremble. It seemed that it had begun to dive deeper into the ground. The night hag suddenly slapped her forehead. My bad. I forgot that there are other guests here. Grandma, you have to get some tables and chairs to entertain the guests." Before her voice trailed off, the belly of the ship, which was as round as a chicken's egg, suddenly emitted a series of soft popping sounds. A dozen short stools instantly rose from the floor of the cabin. The Adversity crossing boat shook even more violently. It moved through the soil like a ship riding the wind and breaking the waves. Shanka took the lead and found a stool to sit on. The rest of the Syrians followed suit and found their own seat. The Syrians did not notice that the leader of the Night Hag army had a cunning glint in her eyes. When all the passengers were seated, the inconspicuous stools suddenly rose. Dozens of fleshy tentacles suddenly sprang up from each of the stools. These tentacles had sharp thorns at the tip. They pierced through the 4 arms of the Syrians in an instant. With a series of gurgling sounds, a large amount of yellow-green ointment was injected into their bodies. Anababa potion, soulless soup. Shanka stood up from the stool. Although the ship was still shaking, she was like a seasoned sailor. She constantly adjusted her pace and center of gravity to maintain her balance. The leader of the Night Hag army walked up to the Syrian diplomat who had always taunted and punished her and slapped him. "You don't like it?" Looking at the Syrian diplomat, who was unable to move after being injected with the Anababa potion, Shanka was instantly enraged. She used her sharp nails to gouge out one of his eyeballs and threw it on the ground. With a plop, she stepped on it and turned it into a meat paste. "I'll leave you an eye so you can take a good look at me." After saying that, the Night Hag ignored the defeated Syrian and turned to study the octagonal artifact on her chest. Ever since she was ambushed by the Syrians in the Grey Wastes, she had been thinking about how to get rid of this shackle. That Syrian diplomat relied on this thing to keep Sanka alive. This was also why Sanka only dared to torture her but did not dare to kill her. If that Syrian diplomat was controlled by a spell or died in an accident, Sanka would never be able to get out of this boat for the rest of her life. Inside this old boat, as long as it remained submerged, Sanka would be protected by the agreement between Saul's stone monsters and the god of earth element, Sanka. Sanka could also be protected when she hid in the body of Elder Saul's stone monster. Other than the gods, it was basically impossible for other mortals to find her. Similarly, the necklace of concealment that the Syrians used to control her had also lost its effect. However, no matter what she did, even if she used a dagger to cut her own flesh, the nameplate of the necklace of concealment was still embedded in Sanka's flesh like an 8-clawed spider. Its 8 claws were firmly grasping her heart. The night hag army tried to gouge out her own heart and replace it with something else or use greater recovery to save herself. But just as she was about to do it, she suddenly remembered the material of the nameplate. It was a fragment of the scale of the time dragon. Even if she gouged out her heart, what if the nameplate filled her chest with her heart the next second? Wouldn't she have gone through the gates of hell in vain? Damn it! Sanka tried again and again but failed. She was so angry that she picked up the dagger and stabbed it into the Serene diplomat's mouth. Then, she forcefully twisted the tongue-shaped ovipositor, which was the diplomat's reproductive organ. The tentacles that were tied to the diplomat's body hurriedly injected some ghost-witch medicine that had healing properties into her body. This was the only way to save the Sierra diplomat's life. "My dear granddaughter, you seem to be in a hurry." Kiki. Tengu, whose voice was like a night owl, saw Shanka's every move. If he could see the pink brain floating in the glass container, he could also recognize it. At this moment, the brain, which was the old grandmother of the leader of the night hag army, suddenly had a lot of thoughts in her mind. "Shut up, old witch!" Sanka scolded. Tengu only laughed awkwardly, but it did not seem to be afraid at all. The night hag army stared at the brain in the vat angrily. She reached out her hand and pulled the dagger out of the diplomat's mouth. With a splashing sound, another puff of blood came out. "What are you up to now? Don't try to fool me. You know that I was taught by you." Kiki. That's right. My little Sanka is the most talented. Most of my abilities, you've already surpassed me. However, when teaching the younger generation, which night hag army doesn't hold back. Of course, I'm not an exception. My dear granddaughter, don't you want to listen to my advice? Why don't you beg me? Sanka ignored the Tengu's voice. She walked to the glass container that contained the pink night hag army's brain. She tore off her thin gauze clothes, revealing the wound on her chest that had already healed. What's the use of begging you? Do you have the ability to remove a magic artifact made from the body of a time dragon? Back then, you only made some fakes that imitated the body of a red dragon, and then you were cut into 4 pieces by a red dragon. You can't even deal with a red dragon. Time dragon. You must be dreaming. As she spoke, the night hag army pulled out a tube of potion from the interspatial pouch behind her butt. The bright red solution kept churning up and down in the glass tube, seeming to be very active. This is a confession potion made from the devil pepper, a specialty of the 9 prisons of Bader. You taught me. Do you know what effect this thing will have if it's poured on a person, Grandma? She used her fingernail to twist open the rubber stopper on the glass tube. She shook it, and a plume of pungent smoke came out of the glass tube. The night hag army hurriedly moved it away from her body, so that it wouldn't burn her eyes. However, she moved it away from her body and stretched out her hand to the top of the glass container. Looking at her trembling hand, it seemed that she was going to throw it down at any time. Take it away, take it away. The night hag army's brain hurriedly spoke through the Tengu. As the inventor of this potion, she knew very well how terrifying this potion was. Originally, she wanted to make a condiment that could be sold to the devil. However, she ended up making a magical potion that even the Batsu people couldn't accept. The potion was so hot that it could only be used to force a confession. Seeing that Shanka was unmoved, the night hag army could only reveal a few more things. Although I'm weak, I've imitated the body of a megalosaurus for so many years. You know this. Therefore, even if I'm not 100% sure that I can solve the time bomb on your chest, it shouldn't be a problem to make it less dangerous. However, you want to negotiate? Hearing her grandmother's words, Shanka suppressed the excitement in her heart. She still pretended to speak in a tone that was not a big deal. It's not impossible, but you have to give me a reason that can convince me. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.